Before the press, before the hum of machines and the rhythm of turning pages, there was only silence. A silence so thick it lived in the walls of monasteries, in the breath of scholars bent over parchment, in the long shadows cast by single flames. Words were not yet free. They were prisoners of patience, ink trapped inside animal skin. Thought locked inside ink. To write was to bleed time itself, and to read was a privilege few would ever taste. In those centuries, knowledge did not travel, it lingered. The world's wisdom rested on shelves of oak, heavy with dust, guarded by men who believed that truth should move no faster than prayer. Books were chained, literally, to wooden tables, their bindings bound to the desks that bore them. Each chain rattled softly when opened, a metallic whisper reminding the reader that freedom of thought was not yet born. Outside those stone walls, whole villages might live and die without ever touching a word that had not been spoken aloud. Inside the scriptoria, the air carried the faint scent of candle wax and ink. The monks copied not with haste but with reverence. Each letter a ritual, each stroke a confession. Hours passed unnoticed as they bent over vellum, their backs aching, their eyes dim from the trembling light. The scratching of quills echoed like tiny heartbeats in the quiet. If one monk erred, the page might be scraped clean with a knife, time itself rewritten. Some saw it as holy work. Others, though they would never admit it, feared the weight of what they preserved. For to write was to preserve power, and power belonged to the few. Outside the monasteries, the world was illiterate by design. Kings ruled through decrees no commoner could read. Priests interpreted the divine for flocks who could only listen. Even merchants, who measured their lives by numbers, relied on scribes to shape the lines that bound their fortunes. To control words was to command the world. In the stillness of that order, authority flourished not by strength, but by secrecy. A peasant could memorize prayers, repeat sermons, perhaps recall the stories told by travelers who carried news like drifting seeds. Yet memory was fragile. It bent beneath emotion, faded under time, and reshaped itself with every retelling. What survived from one generation to the next was not truth, but resemblance. In that fragile web of oral tradition, history itself could be rewritten with a sigh. A king could become a saint, a heretic, a monster. The truth was, whatever the hand that held the quill decided it to be. Imagine the night air of a medieval village. Smoke curling from hearths, the hush of animals settling into straw, the faint ring of distant bells. Somewhere beyond the walls, a monastery stands its windows, glowing like watchful eyes. Inside, a single monk leans close to his page. His fingers are stained black. The quill trembles as it dips again into ink. He is not writing for himself. He is writing for eternity, though he will never see its face. His candle burns lower, and still he writes, word after word, binding time with silence. This was how knowledge survived, through endurance, not abundance. There were no libraries in the modern sense, only vaults of devotion. The great manuscripts, the Bible, Aristotle's treatises, the works of the ancients were treasures of the elite. Their words might take years to copy, each one costing the labor of a dozen men. To own a book was to hold the work of lifetimes, and so books became relics. They were kissed, feared, hidden, and burned. The written word was not a companion. It was an idol. Yet even idols crack. Beneath the gilded surface of obedience, curiosity stirred. A whisper ran through the halls of learning. Why must words belong only to the chosen? In Italy, scholars began to rediscover the forgotten voices of Greece and Rome. In France, merchants sought contracts, maps, and ledgers to navigate the new wealth of trade. In Germany, craftsmen toyed with metals and presses used for coins. The world was shifting, quietly, beneath the surface of its own order. The medieval calm was not peace, it was the pause before a storm. Still, for most, the night of ignorance felt eternal. Centuries passed like a single breath drawn and held too long. Humanity waited, not knowing what it waited for. The few who dreamed of faster words were dismissed as heretics or fools. Who could imagine that thought itself might one day move faster than a horse? That one idea could leap from hand to hand without distortion? That a single page could exist in 1,000 places at once? Such things belong to magic, not men. And yet, The tools of magic already existed in the hands of artisans, metalworkers, and visionaries who shaped letters not from ink, but from molten lead. In small workshops and dim basements, they forged symbols that could be rearranged, reused, reborn. Every letter identical, every word eternal. But the world above did not yet know it was changing. The candles still flickered. The chains still rattled. The monks still whispered. There is a peculiar beauty in scarcity. When each book is a treasure, each word carries the gravity of prayer. But scarcity also breeds silence. Whole lives passed unrecorded, entire civilizations half-remembered. The words that could have freed minds remained unwritten, or worse, unimagined. Humanity was still blind to its reflection. And so the night deepened. Empires rose and fell without witness. Discoveries vanished when their keepers died. For every story told, 1,000 others dissolved into dust. The written word was too slow to keep pace with the beating of time. The world spoke faster than it could remember. Then, somewhere in the heart of Europe, a craftsman began to listen to that silence. He did not pray over parchment. He listened to the clatter of metal, the hiss of molten lead, the pulse of invention. He understood that words did not need to crawl, they could march. The world did not know his name yet, but soon it would. Because one day, the silence would break, the chains would fall, and words, once bound by hands of monks and kings, would learn to run. In the quiet heart of 15th century minds, among the clang of forges and the murmur of the Rhine, a man worked long after the other workshops had gone dark. The neighbors called him restless, though few ever saw what he made. His name was Johannes Gutenberg, a craftsman's son, trained in the hard patience of metal. By trade, he shaped coins for bishops and princes, stamping value into silver so pure that no man could doubt its worth. Yet even then, as molten metal cooled beneath his hammer, he was already dreaming of another kind of currency, one made not of gold, but of thought. He lived as if the world were listening, though no one cared about a blacksmith's secrets. Mainz was full of guilds and jealous craftsmen. The smallest rumour could ruin a man. So Gutenberg learned to work in silence. He kept his shutters closed, and his workers sworn to oaths as binding as scripture. The sound of his hammer became a code, sharp and rhythmic, striking patterns no ear could decipher. People said he was minting coins in secret. They were wrong, but not entirely. He was trying to mint words. His hands were scarred from the press, his eyes dulled by years of staring at metal under firelight, yet his mind moved faster than his tools. He had seen how authority clung to words like armor, how a decree stamped in wax could move armies, how a letter sealed by a king could silence nations. He understood that power did not live in crowns or swords, but in the symbols that described them. If metal could shape value, then perhaps metal could also shape truth. The idea began small letters cut from lead instead of carved by hand, each one identical, each one eternal. 1,000 identical A's, 1,000 unchanging B's. He could press them together, take them apart, rearrange them as thought itself rearranges. But to make them perfect, he needed precision only a mint master would know. The right alloy, the right mold, the right tension between pressure and ink. It was an art too delicate for brute strength and too technical for mere inspiration. Failure became his constant companion. Ink bled, letters cracked, paper tore. The press itself groaned like a living beast. He melted his metals again and again, searching for balance between strength and fluidity. Every mistake cost him money he did not have. Investors came and went, debts followed him like ghosts. Yet each time ruin crept close, he would return to his workshop and begin again, the air thick with the smell of oil and desperation. In that dim light, he was not the icon of invention that history would later remember. He was a man cornered by obsession, pacing between shadows and half-finished machines. He spoke little, even to those who worked beside him. Some nights, he murmured to the letters as if they were alive, testing their edges with his fingertips, whispering fragments of prayers or curses. To the townsfolk, he seemed cursed, indeed a man burning his fortune to feed a dream no one could see. But word spreads, even through silence. Merchants began to wonder what the blacksmith was hiding. Rivals sent spies to peer through keyholes, to bribe apprentices, to copy fragments of design. Mainz was a small city, and secrecy was a fragile thing. Gutenberg moved his workshop more than once, always chased by suspicion, always one step ahead of ruin. His machines grew heavier, his debts deeper. Each relocation left behind rumors like ash of sorcery, of forbidden alchemy, of strange symbols etched into iron. What he guarded, though, was not gold or sorcery. It was the first whisper of a revolution. For in the slow rhythm of his work, he was dismantling the oldest hierarchy of all, the one that decided who was allowed to know. If his press succeeded, a priest's sermon, a scholar's treatise, or a poet's verse could be multiplied endlessly, copied by the hundreds instead of the handfuls. The chain between knowledge and privilege would begin to rust. He could not have known how far it would reach that the same metal letters he cast in secret would one day build empires and topple them. He saw only the task before him, the alignment of parts, the smoothness of pressure, the patience of precision. He was building a machine that would outlive him, though he had no reason to believe it would work at all. Yet that is how most revolutions begin, not with certainty, but with stubbornness. Sometimes, when exhaustion overcame him, he would step outside and listen to the city breathe. The river carried barges laden with wine and timber, the cathedral bells tolled their iron hymns, and beyond it, all stretched the quiet of a Europe half asleep. He must have felt it, the stillness before awakening, the pulse beneath the silence. The night sky over Mainz shimmered with faint stars, and in that vast, indifferent darkness, he stood alone, holding the blueprint of a future no one had asked for. To the world, he was only a blacksmith, a man who hammered metal for coin. But history was already waiting for him, patient as the ink that would soon meet his press. In the secrecy of his workshop, the boundaries between labor and creation blurred. The same hands that once shaped the mark of kings were now shaping the alphabet that would dethrone them. Every age has its hidden forges, places where the next transformation begins quietly, far from the eyes of power. Gutenberg's forge was one of them. His hammer did not strike gold that night. It struck the invisible wall between the few who ruled and the many who listened. Each blow left a crack. Each experiment widened it, until one day the wall would crumble. And when it did, the sound would not be of metal breaking, but of voices rising. The echo of those nights in Mainz, the steady beat of hammer against anvil, of faith against fear, would become the heartbeat of a new world. Soon, the silence that had ruled for centuries would give way to a new kind of thunder. Every revolution begins in failure. Before ink could meet paper, before the press could whisper its first word, there was struggle, slow, grinding, invisible. In the workshop at Mainz, Johannes Gutenberg labored not as a prophet, but as a man possessed. The myth that history would later craft from his name was still unformed, buried beneath years of disappointment, smoke, and silence. His invention did not spring forth whole. It crawled, faltered, and nearly died in his hands. The forge glowed red through the night, a small sun burning behind shuttered windows. The smell of metal and oil thickened the air until breathing felt like swallowing smoke. Gutenberg's tools lay scattered across the workbench, crucibles blackened by failure, moulds half filled with imperfect lead, fragments of broken type that bore the faint scars of ambition. The sound of his hammer had changed slower now, deliberate, echoing with the fatigue of repetition. He had spent years chasing a material that would not betray him, an alloy strong enough to survive the pressure of his press, yet soft enough to hold the delicate shape of a letter. Too brittle, and the type shattered. Too malleable, and it warped. Each batch meant days lost, coins spent, patience burned. He had once minted coins, now he was minting thought. But unlike silver, thought refused to behave. There were other failures too, quieter ones. The ink, meant to cling to the metal like loyalty, refused to stay. It bled, smudged, soaked through the page. The paper itself, too coarse or too damp, tore under the press's embrace. Each trial ended in ruin. Whole nights passed without a single clean print. In those hours, the workshop became a kind of purgatory, lit by fire, haunted by purpose. He could hear the hiss of molten metal cooling, the sigh of parchment as it curled. Outside, the city slept. Inside, one man wrestled with the limits of creation. Sometimes he cursed the gods of his craft. Sometimes he whispered prayers. But mostly, he kept working. There was no glory in these nights, only repetition, the same process over and over, the same small hopes extinguished and rekindled. Every failure carved another mark into his resolve. His hands, once the tools of a craftsman, had become instruments of endurance. His mind, once sharp with theory, now wavered between obsession and faith. The world beyond his workshop had no patience for such madness. Investors grew restless. Money vanished faster than ink dried. Promises had been made, promises of a miracle machine that could multiply words like seed. Yet all they saw were debts and delays. Whispers began again. That Gutenberg's genius was fiction, that he was chasing phantoms, that perhaps he had lost his mind. He did not deny it. In his own way, he had. To create something the world could not yet imagine, he had to live half inside it. When exhaustion overcame him, he would sit beside the cooling forge and study his failures. Each warped letter was a teacher, each cracked mold a message. The perfection he sought was not mechanical, it was almost spiritual. He believed that somewhere, hidden in the balance between heat and weight, lay the soul of replication. The world had copied images before, carved woodblocks that stamped saints and kings onto parchment. But Gutenberg wanted more than image. He wanted voice. The kind that could repeat endlessly, unbroken, uncorrupted. There were moments when he nearly gave up. Moments when the metal refused to obey, when the press shattered under strain, when a month's labor dissolved in a single misstep. The walls of his workshop seemed to close in, yet even in despair, he could not stop. There was something in him that refused to yield a quiet defiance, the same spirit that had carried men across oceans and monks across centuries of silence. Every error whispered back at him. Not yet. He began to treat failure like an apprentice. He catalogued mistakes, adjusted angles, measured pressure, calculated the dryness of paper and the viscosity of oil. His workshop became a laboratory long before the word existed. Each success, however small, felt like a heartbeat. A letter printed clearly, an ink that clung to its shape, a page that held steady. Progress so subtle no one else would have noticed, but he did. He saw in those fragments the outline of a revolution. Sometimes he thought of the monks who had once copied books by hand, men who believed that words were divine property, too sacred to multiply. He wondered if they could forgive him for what he was about to unleash. Perhaps not. But then, he reasoned, truth had never been the enemy of faith, only of control. And control was what he was breaking, stroke by stroke, press by press. The turning point came quietly. It was not a burst of triumph, but a murmur of realization. After years of trial, his alloy finally held a perfect marriage of lead, tin, and antimony. The letters, once fragile, now endured the pressure. The ink, thickened with oil, no longer bled, but embraced the metal with precision. For the first time, he pulled a page from his press that did not weep or warp. The letters stood proud and sharp, like soldiers ready for battle. He stared at it for a long time, as if afraid to breathe. The words on that page were not yet sacred, not yet immortal, but they were alive. For the first time, they existed outside of his mind. A page of black ink, ordinary to any other eye, but to him it was proof that the impossible could be forged by human hands. He did not shout, he did not weep. He simply set the page aside, cleaned his hands, and began again, this time with quiet certainty. The machine that had tormented him for years was finally listening. The pieces fit. The rhythm of the press began to resemble the rhythm of a heartbeat. The world was still asleep, but its awakening had begun. Soon, the first complete work would emerge from that workshop, a book that no king could silence, no priest could contain. But for now, in the heat and stillness of that forge, there was only one man, his press, and the faint whisper of the future turning its first page. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the windows, the world shifted unaware that its silence had already been broken. The moment came quietly, as great moments often do, not with thunder or applause, but with the deep exhale of a man who had spent half his life trying to coax a miracle from metal. In the dim light of the Mainz workshop, the air was thick with the scent of oil and molten lead, of parchment and sweat. Johannes Gutenberg stood before his press, that strange, wooden creature of his own making, and turned the handle with slow precision. It groaned as if waking from a dream, the iron jaws tightening, the wooden frame trembling with life. When he lifted the plate and peeled the page free, the world changed forever. The ink shone wet beneath the light, black and perfect. Lines of type, once separate fragments of metal, now lay together as one, a single voice, clear and unwavering. 42 lines in all, each identical, each deliberate, each whispering of permanence. He held the page to the candle's flame, not to burn it, but to see if the ink would hold. It did. The letters stood unyielding, their edges sharp as the morning frost. For the first time in history, a page existed that could be replicated without error, multiplied without end. Around him, his apprentices watched in reverent silence. They did not fully grasp what they were witnessing, only that something alive had entered the room. The machine no longer seemed mechanical. It breathed. The wooden levers creaked like sinew, the rollers exhaled soft sighs of pressure, the ink shimmered like blood beneath skin. It was as though the press itself possessed a pulse. Gutenberg could feel it through his fingertips, the vibration of creation, the heartbeat of a new age. He laid the page beside another, then another, aligning them with the care of a surgeon. Identical. Perfect. The miracle was not that he had printed words, but that he had printed them again, and each time they were the same. The era of singularity was ending. The era of infinity had begun. Outside, the bells of Mainz rang the hour, unaware that the sound they carried now belonged to a different world. For centuries, knowledge had been confined to the few, guarded by monks, licensed by kings, rationed by scribes. But with that first page, Gutenberg had breached the wall. Words, once imprisoned by time and distance, had found a way to multiply. And with multiplication came danger, because nothing multiplies faster than ideas. He touched the surface of the page, smudging a trace of ink onto his fingers. That stain, he knew, would never wash clean. It was the mark of his creation, a creation both sacred and subversive. He thought of the monks he had seen in his youth, bending over their manuscripts, copying the same line of scripture again and again, believing that to replicate was to serve God. Now replication itself had become divine. He was no longer a servant of scripture, he was its liberator. The first printed sheets dried on racks hung by the windows. The late sun fell through the glass, gilding them in light. To any passer-by, they looked like nothing more than pages of text. Yet each one was a silent rebellion. Each one promised that no decree could remain unchallenged, no truth could remain owned. The letters on those pages were identical, and that sameness was their power. For the first time, truth could stand independent of the hand that wrote it. He leaned close, reading aloud the opening lines. His voice trembled, not with weakness but with awe. The words themselves were ancient, drawn from the Bible, yet they had never sounded so new. In them was not just faith, but replication, the promise that once a thought had been shaped, it could never again be contained. The ink dried, and with it, the age of silence began to fade. As the first complete pages of the 42-line Bible took form, the press fell into rhythm, a steady, deliberate cadence, like the beating of a heart. The apprentices moved with mechanical grace, one inking, one pressing, one laying the next sheet. Day after day, night after night, the cycle continued. The workshop became a symphony of labor. The thump of wood, the hiss of ink, the shuffle of parchment, each sound a note in the anthem of a new world. Sometimes, when the others slept, Gutenberg would return alone to the press. He would touch the frame, feeling the faint warmth still clinging to the wood, as though the machine itself were alive. He had built it from fragments, borrowed parts of wine presses, minting screws, and wooden frames, yet it had become something greater than the sum of its materials. It was no longer his tool. It was his companion, his rival, his legacy. He wondered if he had gone too far. The church, after all, had already begun to sense what his invention meant. Words, once kept behind the veil of Latin and hierarchy, could now spill into the tongues of ordinary men. He was forging not just a machine, but a weapon, one that could pierce through authority itself. And yet, he could not stop. The hunger to replicate, to release knowledge from its chains, had become his faith. The completed sheets piled higher, hundreds upon hundreds of pages. The first Bible would require years to finish, but the first moment had already arrived. The miracle had already occurred. Somewhere, deep within the press, the ancient partnership between word and flesh had been broken. The quill had given way to the mould. The hand had surrendered to the machine. He did not yet see the empires his press would challenge, or the wars of faith it would ignite. He saw only the perfection of the page, the crispness of its margins, the dark clarity of its ink, the measured beauty of its type. For him, that was enough. He had made the intangible tangible, given thought a body. When dawn came, the city outside was quiet. Smoke drifted from chimneys. The river gleamed faintly in the first light. Gutenberg stepped out into the chill air, his hands still dark with ink. Somewhere behind him, the press rested silent for now, but still alive. The faint smell of oil lingered on the breeze, mingling with the scent of morning. He could not yet know that he had touched eternity. The first printed word had been born. It breathed, multiplied, and began to wander a new species of idea, untamed and unstoppable. And though the workshop's door would close behind him, the world would never again be silent. Soon, the press would escape its maker, and knowledge would no longer ask permission to exist. At first, it spread quietly. A handful of presses here, a few curious craftsmen there. Sheets of inked parchment traded like trinkets in market stalls. But beneath the surface, something vast was beginning to stir. What Gutenberg had built in secret was no longer his alone. The idea itself had slipped free. It crossed borders not as an invention, but as a contagion, carried by merchants, apprentices, and dreamers who had glimpsed its power. The press could be copied, improved, rebuilt. Within years, its rhythm echoed through every corner of Europe, the steady heartbeat of a continent awakening. In the cities, smoke rose from new workshops, where presses thudded through the night. In Venice, printers laboured by lamplight beside canals, the scent of ink mingling with salt and rot. In Paris, scholars pooled their savings to fund machines of their own, filling dormitories with fresh pages that smelled of oil and thought. In Nuremberg and Florence, young apprentices inked type with trembling fingers, watching as the first words of their lives appeared in perfect black relief. Each sheet they printed felt like a small rebellion, a declaration that knowledge no longer belonged to the few. Word travelled faster than permission. Pamphlets were cheap, quick to print, and impossible to contain. A sermon written in Mainz could reach London in a month, whispered from ship to ship, tavern to tavern. A scholar's critique of a bishop could pass through 10 cities before the bishop even learned of it. Books once rarer than jewels now appeared in dozens of hands, identical and defiant. What once took years to copy could now multiply in weeks. The balance of time itself had shifted. The powerful still ruled, but their control was built on delay, and delay was dying. The flood began in Latin, but it did not stay there. Printers soon turned to the languages of the people, German, French, Dutch, Italian tongues that priests and nobles had long dismissed as unworthy of scripture or scholarship. Now those same languages poured across pages, giving form to thoughts that had never before been written. For the first time, ordinary men and women could read prayers in their own words, letters that spoke not from the pulpit but from the heart. A strange electricity charged the air. Universities buzzed with debate, markets brimmed with printed maps and calendars, and the walls of cities bloomed with broadsheets nailed like proclamations. Travellers carried news printed yesterday that could overturn truths believed for centuries. The church still spoke of revelation as divine, but revelation now came in ink. The world's geography changed, not on its surface, but in its mind. Imagine a map of Europe painted black, where every press was born. The first dots appear around Mainz, small and uncertain. Then Venice, Paris, Basel, Krakow. The ink spreads outward, branching like veins, until the continent glistens with dark rivers of thought. Every city touched by print grows louder. The monasteries, once the guardians of silence, can no longer compete with the din. The flood did not ask for permission, and it spared no one. Merchants used it to advertise goods. Soldiers carried printed handbills that glorified victory or lamented defeat. Lovers sent verses to one another, identical and infinite. Even kings, suspicious though they were, found themselves forced to use it to print decrees, laws, and defences against their own citizens. The more they used it, the more it escaped them. Power was no longer a fortress. It was a current, and ink flowed through its cracks. Yet, for all its speed, the flood carried contradiction. The same machine that printed scripture printed heresy. The same press that spread devotion spread doubt. In the taverns of London, readers argued over interpretations of the Bible. In Florence, pamphlets mocked the Pope with biting satire. In Prague, scholars used the press to defend faith against corruption and to accuse faith of it. Ideas collided like storms, and no authority could predict where lightning would strike next. But to those who lived within it, the chaos felt alive, exhilarating, terrifying, unstoppable. The streets filled with readers who had once been silent listeners. Words, once a privilege, became a noise too vast to quiet. A peasant might quote Aristotle. A merchant might debate salvation. Every page became a doorway into a larger world. And as more presses appeared, the flood grew deeper, its current swifter. In the homes of craftsmen, candles burned late into the night as fathers taught their sons to read from printed psalms. In the chambers of scholars, books stacked like bricks against the walls, not luxuries now, but tools. The press had turned reading from ritual into routine, and routine into revolution. Knowledge, multiplied, became momentum. There were those who resisted. Scribes who had spent their lives copying by hand cursed the machines that made them obsolete. Some burned their tools in despair. Others joined the presses themselves, trading pen for type. The transition was not gentle. Every change in history bruises the old to make room for the new. Yet the pull of progress was irresistible. To live in that time was to feel the future tugging at your sleeve. And still, the flood rose. Printers experimented with smaller books that could be carried in pockets, hidden under cloaks, smuggled across borders. Secrets became portable. Forbidden texts moved faster than armies. The church's censors scrambled to seize presses, to ban titles, to burn copies, but the embers of one fire always lit the next. Each banned book became a prophecy fulfilled. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when the old order began to tremble. Kings realized their proclamations no longer echoed alone. Priests realized that faith, once handed down, could now be questioned in ink. The written word had become an army of its own, countless, formless, without flag or border, and its soldiers were ideas. Somewhere in Mainz, perhaps years after Gutenberg's first print, someone must have handed him one of these new books, thinner, cheaper, born of imitation rather than reverence. He might have frowned at its roughness, its hurried type, the imperfections he had once sworn to eliminate. But if he looked closer, he would have recognized something familiar in it. The pulse, the breath, the promise of the press still alive. His creation had escaped him, as all great creations do. What he began in secrecy had become a public storm. The flood of ink had no single master, no single purpose. It carried truth and falsehood, devotion and defiance, wisdom and noise all at once. And in that chaos, humanity felt itself expanding, reaching beyond its old boundaries. The ink now flowed faster than any king could chase, faster than any church could bless. The age of silence had drowned in its own discovery. The written word no longer belonged to the few, it belonged to the world. But every flood leaves behind its shadow, and soon, those who had ruled through silence would rise to reclaim control. The church would awaken, and fear would return to the page. For centuries, the church had ruled not only the souls of men but their words. Truth flowed from the pulpit downward, unchallenged, sanctified by ritual and fear. But now, in the wake of the flood, truth had learned to run in every direction. The press, once a mere tool of craft, had become something far more dangerous, a weapon in the hands of anyone brave enough to use it. The church watched the spread of printed pages with growing unease, realizing too late that the ink could not be unspilled. At first, it was disbelief. Bishops received reports of strange pamphlets appearing in cities across Europe, sermons not approved by Rome, prayers written in the language of commoners. Some blamed merchants, others blamed heretics. Few understood that a new kind of fire was spreading, one that no decree could extinguish. Books once confined to cloisters now lay in taverns, in the hands of fishermen and masons, their pages whispered over like contraband. The clergy saw danger not in what was said, but in who was listening. Censorship arrived quietly, cloaked in righteousness. Edicts were issued from cathedrals warning against false scriptures. Inquisition officials began to scour printing shops, demanding licenses and stamping seals of approval upon safe texts. Printers caught without authorization faced ruin, their presses seized, their families shamed, sometimes worse. Yet every crackdown seemed only to feed the hunger. The forbidden always travels faster than the blessed. In the back streets of Paris and Venice, secret presses sprang up like mushrooms after rain. Their doors were disguised, their windows blackened with soot. Inside, the air pulsed with danger, the rhythmic thud of hidden machinery, the scent of ink mixed with fear. Apprentices worked in silence, listening for footsteps on the stair. Each page they printed was an act of defiance, each bound volume a spark against the darkness of control. Outside, the church intensified its campaign. Public bonfires were held in the squares of Cologne, Florence, and Antwerp. Priests stood over the flames, tossing books into the blaze while crowds watched, uncertain whether to cheer or grieve. The fire crackled, pages curling and blackening, words turning to smoke that twisted into the sky, a grim irony for an institution built upon the word itself. But no matter how high the flames reached, there was always another press, another printer, another secret copy tucked away beneath a floorboard. The Inquisition grew sharper, whispers of informants filled the air, neighbors betrayed neighbors. In one city, a scholar was accused of heresy for owning a Greek translation of the New Testament. In another, a printer's apprentice vanished after boasting that his pages had crossed the Alps. Fear became the church's ink, printed invisibly on every decree. To read the wrong book was to gamble with one's soul and one's life. Yet, in that fear, something beautiful took root. The faithful who longed for truth began to gather in secret. They met in cellars, barns, candle-lit attics. They passed pages hand to hand, reading in whispers, each word a forbidden prayer. When the church closed the doors of knowledge, the people built hidden libraries. When it silenced voices, they learned to read in the quiet. A strange transformation unfolded. Faith, once defined by obedience, began to merge with courage. The printing press had not destroyed religion. It had forced it to evolve. The church saw heresy. Others saw liberation. Ordinary men and women began to realize that salvation could be sought not through intermediaries, but through understanding. Scripture was no longer a mystery locked in Latin. It was a story that spoke directly to them. The very act of reading became a kind of rebellion not against God, but against those who claimed to own him. In the eyes of authority, each new reader was a potential heretic. The press had multiplied not just books, but minds, and minds could not be burned. For every copy that turned to ash, 2 more emerged elsewhere. The underground printers became ghosts, moving from city to city under false names. They printed by candlelight, disguising holy texts as merchant ledgers or hiding them beneath bindings labeled with false titles. A single slip of paper might travel hundreds of miles, passed from hand to trembling hand like a relic. In Basel, a printer named Froben risked everything to publish works of humanist thinkers who dared to question divine authority. In Florence, apprentices smuggled banned tracts inside barrels of olive oil. In Antwerp, merchants hid reformist sermons among shipments of cloth. The network of resistance grew wider than any army. The church was powerful, but it could not be everywhere. And each act of defiance, no matter how small, chipped away at the illusion of control. For the first time in history, words moved faster than decree. A ban announced in Rome could be mocked in Amsterdam before the ink dried. The church's commands, once carved into stone, now faded against the tide of paper. The voice of authority, once singular, began to echo, distorted, questioned, rivaled by 1,000 others. Still, the church did not yield. It doubled down, creating indices of forbidden books, long lists of texts declared unholy, dangerous, or deceptive. Ironically, these lists became guides for the curious, maps pointing straight toward what was worth reading. The forbidden drew readers like moths to flame. In trying to silence dissent, the church had given it a name. And yet, not all opposition came from malice. Many within the church wrestled with conscience. Some priests hid banned works in their cells, believing that truth was too vast to fear. Others wept as they watched the flames consume the words they loved. Faith itself began to fracture between those who sought to protect belief and those who sought to protect understanding. The struggle was no longer between heretics and believers, but between those who trusted minds and those who trusted power. It was not a war fought with swords, but with sentences. The battlefield was the page. As the years passed, the fires continued, but so did the presses. The two forces, repression and creation, fed one another like storm and tide. Each act of censorship gave birth to another act of defiance. Each attempt to silence a word made it louder. The church could punish bodies, but not thoughts. Every martyr only amplified the cause. And so, out of fear, something unstoppable began to form. The whispers grew bolder. The hidden presses multiplied. The forbidden books no longer whispered of sin, but of freedom, the right to think, to read, to question. What began as the church's counterattack would soon become its undoing. From within the shadows of censorship, a louder voice was rising, one that would not only challenge the church, but the very idea of obedience itself. The press had made faith dangerous, and from that danger, revolution was already taking shape. It began, as so many revolutions do, with a single sound, the thud of a hammer against wood. The year was 1517. The place, a quiet university town called Wittenberg. A monk, in a dark robe, stood before the heavy doors of a church and nailed to them a sheet of paper. 95 statements, simple words, written in Latin. To the few who saw him that day, it seemed an act of scholarly debate, a cleric challenging corruption, nothing more. But to history, that hammer strike was thunder. Martin Luther did not know it, but the moment his hammer fell, Gutenberg's press awoke once more. The metal letters that had slept for half a century found their purpose again. Within days, his theses were copied, typeset, and printed. Within weeks, they travelled farther than any sermon ever spoken. The monk's protest, meant for a handful of scholars, crossed mountains and seas. The presses of Germany, Switzerland, and France took up his words like a hymn and sang them into every corner of Europe. Before Luther, reform had been the dream of a few. After him, it became the language of the many. The press turned his voice into an army. Each printed sheet was a messenger, each pamphlet a spark. Towns that had never heard his name began to whisper it. Inns, universities, and marketplaces buzzed with argument. The church, vast and immovable for centuries, suddenly found itself standing on trembling ground. The magic of Luther's message was not only in its defiance, but in its familiarity. He spoke of faith not as a code to be bought or sold, but as a truth every soul could touch. He denounced indulgences, those paper promises of salvation that priests sold like merchandise. His anger was simple, human, contagious. And when his words met the press, they multiplied like breath on glass, spreading faster than authority could smother them. The same printing houses that once whispered scripture under threat of fire now worked openly. Their presses clattered day and night, devouring paper, spitting ink. The smell of oil and metal filled the streets. Luther's face began to appear in crude woodcuts, his eyes fierce, his posture unbending. For the first time in history, a man's ideas travelled faster than his body. He had become both author and echo, saint and heretic, all at once. The church struck back, as it always did. It banned his writings, condemned him, summoned him to recant. But the more it resisted, the more the presses roared. Each ban became an advertisement. Each condemnation became proof that power feared truth. Luther's words, printed in the thousands, no longer belonged to him. They had become everyone's rebellion. Printers were the new apostles. They worked in hidden workshops, smuggling his pamphlets across borders. Women hid copies under their skirts. Students read them by candlelight in locked rooms. The smell of ink became the scent of insurrection. Luther's words were not whispered. They were shouted, debated, memorized. The faithful no longer waited for the priest to interpret God. They found God in the printed word itself. And the Bible, once chained to the altar, locked in Latin, began to speak in German. Luther's translation of Scripture was not merely an act of piety, it was an act of revolution. When people read the Bible in their own language, they did not just understand faith, they understood power. They saw that the church's voice was not divine by nature, only loud by tradition. Now, for the first time, they could hear their own voices answer back. In villages where sermons had once been met with bowed heads, the people now questioned. In cities, priests faced congregations who quoted scripture from memory. Authority, which had always flowed from the top down, now met a tide rising from below. The press, once an instrument of preservation, had become a weapon of transformation. It was not only faith that trembled, but the structure of the world itself. Monarchs feared that if one monk could defy the church, others might defy kings. The idea that truth could exist outside power spread faster than anyone could contain. The same presses that printed Luther's theses began to print tracts on freedom, conscience, and reason. The press had learned to speak not just for religion, but for humanity. Still, the price was steep. Europe fractured under the strain, families divided, cities burned, nations split along lines of belief. But amid the chaos, a strange clarity emerged. People began to see that truth was not fragile, only control was. Every burned pamphlet gave rise to 10 more. Every silenced preacher inspired 100 new voices. The church's fire consumed books, but it could not consume ideas. In one letter, a frightened bishop described the scene in despair. "It is the books that have done this. They fly through the air faster than birds." And he was right. The age of the pulpit was ending. The age of the printed word had begun. Luther himself became weary of the storm he had unleashed. He saw his teachings twisted, his name used by men with their own ambitions. But even he could not stop what he had started. The press no longer served him, it served no one. It had become a living thing, a force beyond any single hand or mind. The same machine that once whispered devotion now roared with dissent. The Reformation was not the work of one man or one hammer, but of 1,000 presses breathing together in defiance. Luther was its voice, but Gutenberg had built its lungs. Between them, across the span of decades, they had turned faith into fuel and words into wildfire. Imagine the map of Europe once more, not covered in ink this time, but in flame. Each press glows like an ember. Wittenberg burns, then Zurich, then Geneva, then London. The fire leaps from city to city, leaving not ash but awakening. And through that heat, the medieval world melts into something new. The sound of that first hammer strike still echoes, not in the wood of a church door, but in the pulse of every press that followed. A monk's protest had become the world's revolution. What had begun as an argument about sin and salvation had become a declaration of independence for the human mind. And the fire would not stop there. Once the word could challenge the church, it could challenge anything. From the pulpit, the flame would leap to the laboratory, to the throne, to the streets. Faith had been the first battlefield. But soon, reason and power themselves would burn beneath the same light. Out of one man's defiance, a new world was being written line by line, page by page, in ink that no authority could erase. By the mid-16th century, Europe no longer whispered. It argued, shouted, and sang in ink. The presses that had once served scholars and saints were now engines of persuasion, grinding day and night to feed a new appetite, the hunger for opinion. The pamphlet was its meal, small enough to hold in one hand, cheap enough for any printer to risk, and fast enough to outrun truth itself. With it, words became weapons, and ideas became contagious. The pamphlet was unlike anything that had come before. It needed no patron, no permission, no pulpit. A single sheet could be written, printed, and spread within hours. Some were devotional, others scandalous. Some promised salvation, others called for blood. They appeared everywhere, pasted to walls, slipped beneath doors, read aloud in taverns and markets. For the first time, public life had a pulse that beat outside palaces and cathedrals. The people, once listeners, had become participants. Printers no longer worked in the shadows. They were the new messengers of power or its saboteurs. Governments and bishops both sought their loyalty, and their presses became battlefields of ink. Each faction printed its own truths. Each truth accused the others of lies. The pamphlet wars began. In Germany, Protestant reformers flooded cities with broadsheets denouncing Rome, while Catholic printers countered with elegant rebuttals. In England, under Henry VIII, pamphlets defended the king's divorce one month and condemned his heresy the next. In France, anonymous writers fueled riots with venomous verses about royal corruption. The paper was thin, but its weight was immeasurable. It could stir devotion, or hatred, in a single reading. To those alive then, it must have felt dizzying, the world spinning faster, each week birthing new arguments. Truth fractured into fragments, each one demanding belief. The press had freed humanity, but it had also multiplied its noise. The church still thundered from the altar, but its voice was one among thousands. Kings issued decrees, only to see them mocked in print before the ink had dried. The power once concentrated in crowns and mitres, now scattered across pages and pamphlets, fluttering like restless birds through the streets. The language of the pamphlet was not polished. It was alive. It spoke like the crowd it served, quick, emotional, raw. A sermon written for print could move an entire city. A satire could ruin a bishop. Humour became a form of resistance, exaggeration, a kind of truth. Woodcut artists illustrated devils wearing papal hats or kings weighed down by greed, their images crude but unforgettable. Even those who could not read understood their meaning. Every pamphlet carried two forces within it, communication and chaos. Together they built something new, the idea of public opinion. For the first time, rulers feared not just rebellion, but ridicule. The people, once voiceless, had discovered that laughter could wound more deeply than swords. The age of obedience was fading. The age of persuasion had begun. Pamphlets travelled like rumours, untraceable, uncontainable. A single copy could spark 10 others. A printer's apprentice could carry them across borders tucked inside a bundle of cloth. No army could march as fast as a story printed on cheap paper. Governments tried to respond in kind, flooding the streets with their own propaganda. They printed decrees praising kings, sermons defending order, lists of punishments for sedition. But it was too late. The press had made authority porous. The more it spoke, the less it was believed. Every cause learned the same lesson. Print was power, but never control. Once released, a pamphlet no longer belonged to its author. It was interpreted, twisted, reprinted, repurposed. A reformer's tract could become a royal decree. A scholar's warning could fuel a mob. Information, once sacred, had become wild. And yet, within this chaos, something extraordinary unfolded. Ideas began to cross borders that armies could not. A French pamphlet, criticizing taxation, inspired rebellion in the Netherlands. A German satire on papal greed found readers in Scotland. Philosophical arguments whispered between Italy and Poland. Europe's minds were beginning to network, connected not by roads or empires, but by words. The printing press had turned ink into blood, and pamphlets became its circulation. The very structure of thought was changing. No longer vertical from king to subject, from priest to peasant, but horizontal, shared between equals, copied endlessly. The pamphlet was democracy in embryo. But as with all new freedoms, darkness followed. Lies travelled as swiftly as truths. Some printers sold their loyalty to the highest bidder, creating early versions of state propaganda. Others printed for profit, not conviction, turning tragedy into spectacle. In an age before verification, everything depended on belief, and belief was abundant. Crowds gathered to hear readings of supposed miracles, prophecies, confessions. The line between revelation and rumour blurred. The church condemned the flood of print as a new Tower of Babel, too many voices, too much confusion. And indeed, the world did seem louder, less certain. But within that noise was something unstoppable, the sound of humanity learning to speak for itself. The age of pamphlets was an age of contradictions, deceit and enlightenment, rebellion and manipulation, chaos and connection. Printers who once feared the church now feared their readers. Demand was relentless. Every controversy birthed a dozen replies. The presses could not rest. Ink stains marked not only hands but minds. For those who lived through it, reading became as natural as breathing, and as dangerous as fire. The world was now made of words, endless, multiplying, alive. Some historians would later call it the First Information War. It was fought not for land, but for perception. Its soldiers were not soldiers at all, but writers, printers, readers, ordinary people whose only weapon was belief. The winners were not those who spoke loudest, but those who printed fastest. The pamphlet had no memory, yet it changed everything it touched. It shaped revolutions before they had names, spread rumours that became history, and taught power the hardest lesson of all, that truth, once shared, can never again belong to one voice. By the time the century turned, Europe's consciousness had changed beyond recognition. The world that Gutenberg had made was no longer medieval. It was modern, restless, questioning, alive. Faith and monarchy had survived, but neither would ever command silence again. And in the background, the presses still thundered, shaking the foundations of thought. Each page that fell from them carried the same invisible promise that knowledge, once born, would never sleep again. From rebellion, the world now turned toward rebirth. The flood of words that had shaken faith would soon awaken imagination itself. The pamphlets had opened the door, and through it, the Renaissance was waiting. The storm of pamphlets and sermons had passed, but something deeper remained in its wake, a new silence, not of ignorance but of thought. Across Europe, the press no longer served only faith or rebellion. It had found a higher calling, to mirror the mind itself. The same machine that once multiplied scripture now multiplied imagination. The age of belief had given birth to the age of ideas. In Florence, Venice, and Nuremberg, presses beat like hearts inside the arteries of civilization. Their rhythm carried not dogma, but discovery. The smell of ink drifted through the same air that carried the sound of chisels on marble and brushes against canvas. Artists, scholars, and dreamers each found in print the reflection of their own restless curiosity. The printed page became the sketchbook of humanity, a place where thoughts could take form, where wonder could survive the limits of memory. It began with translation, the quiet revolution that turned the sacred languages of power into the living tongues of the people. Once, knowledge had spoken only in Latin, its walls high and narrow. Only the chosen few could climb them. But with the press, Latin began to fracture into 1,000 voices. Greek philosophy appeared in German, Roman poetry whispered in French. Science, art, and scripture began to speak in the languages of streets and marketplaces. The world was suddenly intelligible to itself. Erasmus, the wandering scholar, saw it first. His words, gentle yet piercing, travelled farther than his feet ever could. The praise of folly, his satire of superstition and hypocrisy spread like wildfire among students and princes alike. Through print, Erasmus became not a man, but a network. His thoughts copied, debated, and transformed in cities he would never see. He had not only written a book, he had written himself into the bloodstream of Europe. In Krakow, a mathematician named Nicolaus Copernicus was quietly reimagining the heavens. For years he hesitated, knowing that to suggest the earth moved around the sun was to challenge both faith and reason. Yet when his De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium was finally printed, it escaped him no longer a private meditation, but a public revelation. The universe had shifted, literally and philosophically. The press had turned a solitary stargazer into a force of cosmic change. In Florence, Leonardo da Vinci filled his notebooks with machines, bodies, and dreams, sketches of helicopters, mirrors, and human anatomy. He wrote in secret code, backward, cautious of those who might misunderstand his visions. Though few of his works were printed in his lifetime, he belonged to the same new species of mind that the press had made possible. The self-aware creator, one who could record not just what he saw, but how he thought. Printing taught humanity to externalize its inner life to render consciousness visible. The written word had once been a vessel for divine command. Now it became a mirror for human possibility. Printing did not just record thought, it encouraged it. Knowing one's words might travel beyond one's lifetime changed how people wrote, how they reasoned, how they dreamed. The page became an extension of the self, a fragment of mind pressed into permanence. Every book was an act of defiance against mortality, every printed thought a rebellion against forgetting. The Renaissance was not a rebirth of ancient knowledge alone, it was a rebirth of awareness. The rediscovered texts of Plato and Aristotle, the geometry of Euclid, the medicine of Galen, all of it poured back into Europe like water, returning to a thirsty land. But what transformed this revival into revolution was not merely the content of those works, it was their accessibility. No longer sealed behind the gates of monasteries, they now lay open in bookshops and homes. Knowledge, once rare, became renewable. Painters began to read anatomy, engineers read mathematics, philosophers read the poetry of their peers. Disciplines bled into one another like pigments mixing on a painter's palette. Printing had made it possible for the mind to see itself from every angle. Every discovery was no longer a solitary achievement, but a conversation between centuries, between nations, between souls. And with this awakening came something new, the sense that the world itself was intelligible, that its mysteries could be mapped, measured, and described. The printed diagram, the labeled sketch, the reproducible table, these became tools of understanding. Science began not in laboratories, but in margins, filled with notes and annotations, in the quiet communion between reader and page. The printing press was not merely spreading ideas, it was shaping the structure of thought. For centuries, power had rested on scarcity, the few who knew, and the many who obeyed. But print made scarcity impossible. Once an idea existed on paper, it could never again belong to one man or one crown. The artist's brush and the scholar's quill now shared the same pulse as the printer's press. Creativity itself had become mechanical, repeatable, infinite. In Venice, Aldus Manutius revolutionized publishing by creating small, portable books, volumes that could be carried in a pocket, read by candlelight, or hidden beneath a cloak. He called them libelli portatiles, books that travelled like companions. Knowledge was no longer confined to libraries. It walked among the living. The traveller, the soldier, the merchant, each could carry within him a universe of words. The world grew smaller, yet minds grew vast. The Renaissance man, curious, interdisciplinary, insatiable, was the child of this union between ink and intellect. Leonardo, Erasmus, Copernicus, and countless others did not share a homeland. They shared a medium. The press connected them across distance and time, weaving the first invisible web of human consciousness. But even as this flowering of knowledge spread, a quiet irony took shape. The same press that freed minds also began to standardize them. Grammar, spelling, typography, all became rules where once there had been improvisation. The page unified language as much as it liberated thought. Yet even within that order, creativity thrived. The mind, given structure, found new ways to break it. In workshops from Antwerp to Florence, printers carved fonts that mimicked handwriting, giving the illusion of intimacy to mass production. Books became objects of beauty, as well as knowledge, gilded, illustrated, caressed by collectors and students alike. To hold a printed page was to hold a piece of human thought, made visible, touchable, and eternal. As the presses hummed through the cities, a new awareness settled over Europe, a sense that the mind itself had been multiplied. Every page turned, every idea read aloud, expanded the horizon of possibility. The machine that printed books had begun to print minds, each new reader an author in waiting, each author a mirror of the collective imagination. And as human thought blossomed into art and science, another kind of awakening began to stir. Power, political, economic, and spiritual, watched with envy as ideas grew bolder, freer, less controllable. The monarchs and merchants of Europe were beginning to understand that the same ink that could illuminate also could command. The Renaissance had found its voice. But in the shadows of palaces and counting houses, new ambitions were forming to own the very language that had set humanity free. By the time the presses had settled into every major city, knowledge was no longer just illumination, it was leverage. What began as a spiritual awakening had become an economy of thought. The printed word, once the servant of faith and art, now served a new master, power. Monarchs, merchants, and ministers all began to understand what Gutenberg himself might never have imagined, that paper could move the world faster than armies, and that ink could buy loyalty more effectively than gold. In Venice, the city of mirrors and maps, printers worked for patrons whose motives had little to do with wisdom. The Doge's office commissioned ornate almanacs and public decrees, ensuring that even law and ceremony carried its insignia. In Florence, the Medici family bankers turned rulers, poured money into printing houses, not for poetry, but for propaganda. Their portraits appeared in illustrated books, their victories immortalized in embellished chronicles. To control print was to control memory, and memory was now a commodity. Merchants were no slower to learn the lesson. The age of exploration was dawning, and the sea demanded maps. Printed atlases replaced the whispered secrets of sailors. Trade routes once guarded by guilds became diagrams on paper. Knowledge of coastlines, winds, and ports became as precious as treasure. Whoever held the latest chart could command the waves and the world's wealth. In Antwerp, Venice, and Lisbon, the presses groaned under the weight of demand. Contracts, ledgers, insurance forms, ship manifests, all spilled from the same machines that once printed scripture. The page had become a marketplace. A merchant could print not only his balance sheet but his reputation, spreading his name faster than his ships could sail. And reputation, once earned through blood and lineage, now depended on information how one appeared in print. Even kings began to compete for the press's attention. The image of monarchy, long sculpted in stone and spoken through priests, became something more fragile and far-reaching, a printed illusion. Rulers funded official printers to craft narratives of virtue, power, and divine right. A pamphlet praising a monarch's mercy could travel across borders, reaching subjects who had never seen his face. But beneath that, flattery lurked a quiet truth. Words could serve anyone who could afford them. The same press that glorified kings could, just as easily, destroy them. The press was becoming a double-edged throne. It gave rulers visibility, but visibility demanded constant performance. Silence was now more dangerous than scandal. Every rumor, every political intrigue, could be set to type before dawn and spread by noon. For the first time, public perception began to weigh as heavily as divine authority. Monarchs ruled by ink as much as by decree. In this new order, the world's currency was not gold or silver, but knowledge, the ability to know what others did not, and to decide who could learn it. A merchant's secret ledger, a prince's coded correspondence, a publisher's list of banned works, all became instruments of influence. Printing had democratized learning, but not evenly. Those who could read, interpret, and distribute information formed a new aristocracy, the knowledge elite. They were not kings or knights, but scholars, clerks, navigators, and financiers. They wielded pens instead of swords, and presses instead of armies. Their wealth was invisible, stored in documents and data, not in vaults. They were the first to understand that power lay not in possessing truth, but in shaping its flow. And as they rose, the foundations of the old world began to crack. The Catholic Church, still reeling from Luther's rebellion, tried to reclaim the tide by publishing its own authorized texts. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of forbidden books, became both weapon and advertisement. A printed attempt to define boundaries in a world that no longer had any. But censorship could no longer keep pace with replication. To forbid something was now to give it life. The forbidden was irresistible, and the press multiplied it in secret. In England, the Crown created licensing laws, forcing printers to register their works with the state. In France, the king's inspectors prowled the streets of Paris, raiding unregistered presses. But control was an illusion. The underground networks that had once printed heresy now printed politics. The same energy that had fueled faith's revolution began to fuel ambition. Words that once challenged popes now whispered against kings. Meanwhile, commerce thrived in the shadow of control. The Renaissance mind, once preoccupied with beauty and philosophy, turned toward efficiency. Printed manuals taught arithmetic, navigation, and bookkeeping. Science journals circulated early discoveries. Investors read of voyages to the Indies and formed syndicates, pooling their wealth through printed agreements. Information had become a business model, a way to predict the future and profit from it. The first newspapers emerged from this feverish appetite. Small sheets of announcements and reports, often half rumor and half truth, carried news of wars, harvests, and royal marriages. Each new issue promised a glimpse of the unseen, the elsewhere. Reading became a daily ritual of power, to know before others did. The word news itself carried a strange electricity. It was not simply what had happened, but who controlled the telling. In palaces, secretaries and diplomats traded intelligence as eagerly as merchants traded goods. Letters were intercepted, codes broken, archives built. The act of gathering information became a form of conquest. Armies no longer marched blind. They marched with maps, with treaties, with printed orders that ensured every soldier saw the same words in the same way. What had begun as enlightenment had turned into a game of shadows. Knowledge, once the great equalizer, became the new divide. Those who could not read were ruled by those who could. The printing press, hailed as the liberator of minds, now forged invisible hierarchies, the literate and the illiterate, the informed, and the deceived. Power no longer needed armor, it needed narrative. Printers, once artisans, now stood at the center of this new world. Some became fabulously wealthy, serving kings and corporations alike. Others were hunted for printing the wrong truth. But all of them, knowingly or not, participated in the same quiet revolution, the transformation of thought into currency. A good rumor could buy a fortune, a false promise could start a war. The page had become a battlefield where nations competed not for land, but for belief. In this new age, the alchemy of power was complete. Metal had been turned into type, type into text, text into influence. Gold could be stolen, but information could only spread. The men who understood this, the financiers, navigators, and rulers who mastered print, became the architects of modernity. They did not conquer with swords, but with signatures. And so the Renaissance, which had begun as a celebration of human creativity, now revealed its shadow, a world where knowledge was both light and weapon. The same press that had freed the soul had begun to bind the mind. Yet even in this, there was progress. The gears of civilization had begun to turn faster. Ideas, commerce, and empires were now entwined in the same printed web. Information had become the bloodstream of society, invisible, essential, unstoppable. When paper replaced gold, the world's balance of power quietly flipped. The age of knowledge had become the age of control. And as the presses continued their tireless rhythm, their ink seeped into every chamber of politics, preparing the world for its next awakening when words themselves would rise to challenge kings. By the dawn of the 17th century, Europe had learned how to read, and with that gift came a new kind of danger. The same press that had once liberated thought now served whoever could afford its ink. Truth, once sacred, began to bend beneath the weight of ambition. Every kingdom, every faction, every hungry voice learned the same lesson. Control the story, and you control the world. The printed page became a battlefield. Monarchs hired printers the way they once hired mercenaries. Scholars wrote, not for discovery but for favor. Words, once carriers of wonder, turned into weapons of precision. One pamphlet could crown a hero, another could ruin him. To believe was to take sides, and to read was to risk manipulation. The press, born from faith and reason, had grown into something both divine and deceitful, a machine that could speak any truth, depending on who turned the handle. In Paris, pamphleteers printed tales of royal virtue and enemy corruption, each page thick with flattery or venom. In Amsterdam, newspapers blended commerce with rumor, turning wars and famines into profitable headlines. In London, competing presses fought to define loyalty itself. Royalist broadsheets praised the king, while underground printers mocked him as a tyrant. The public devoured it all. For the first time, information was not just knowledge, it was theatre. The press became the stage, and every crisis became a performance. When nations went to war, printers marched alongside soldiers, carrying type instead of muskets. Battles were fought not only on fields, but in paragraphs. Victory was declared before blood had even dried, and defeats were rewritten before dawn. The ink of propaganda was thicker than water, and it spread faster than truth could swim. The wars of paper were more dangerous than any fought with steel, for they reached the heart instead of the body. In taverns and churches, in marketplaces and drawing rooms, readers argued over conflicting accounts of the same events. The world itself seemed to fracture into versions. There was no longer one Europe, but 1,000, each printed in a different shade of belief. For those who controlled the presses, it was intoxicating. Monarchs discovered that reputation could be managed like territory. They funded loyal printers to broadcast victories, virtues, and decrees. But even as they celebrated their mastery of image, the system slipped from their grasp. Every loyal printer had an imitator, every official truth its shadow. The more they published, the less they were believed. The public, once naive, began to suspect manipulation everywhere. Cynicism was born in the spaces between lines of text. Fake news, though the phrase did not yet exist, had found its first home. During wars of religion, both Catholics and Protestants flooded Europe with pamphlets accusing the other of atrocities many imagined. Some exaggerated, few verified. The reader became the battlefield. Trust was no longer given, it had to be sold. Printers learned that outrage sold better than accuracy. Fear, scandal, and curiosity all could be monetized in ink. Reports of witches, miracles, and monstrous births filled the streets. Booksellers advertised eyewitness accounts that no witness had written. The truth had never been so profitable. Even the great thinkers of the age were not immune. Philosophers found themselves quoted out of context, their ideas distorted to serve agendas they despised. Political pamphleteers borrowed their authority, twisting reason into rhetoric. The language of enlightenment became the dialect of persuasion. Each ideology claimed logic as its own, and the reader, overwhelmed, sought comfort in the familiar rather than the factual. The mind, newly freed, began to crave its own chains. The first media wars were not fought for dominance alone, but for belief itself. Governments printed loyalty into law. Revolutionaries printed freedom into manifestos. Each claimed to represent the people. Each accused the other of deceit. Printing made both rebellion and repression possible. Every uprising began with a whisper, a rumor, a sheet of paper pinned to a wall. The 30 Years' War, that long storm of religion and politics, was as much a war of words as of weapons. Pamphlets depicting enemy soldiers as demons circulated among troops. Sermons, printed and distributed, turned vengeance into virtue. The battlefield extended into every home, every conscience. When truth can be printed, it can also be purchased. Across borders, printers became smugglers of influence. In the Netherlands, presses hidden in basements churned out forbidden material for neighbouring kingdoms. In France, underground networks distributed satirical tracts that mocked kings and cardinals alike. In England, during the Civil War, pamphlets multiplied until no one knew what to believe. Royalists accused Puritans of treachery. Puritans printed proof of divine mission. Each side believed God was on their page. Ordinary citizens, once the audience, became participants. Reading was no longer passive, it was a political act. To hold a pamphlet was to choose allegiance. People gathered in taverns, not for drink but for discourse. Arguments spilled into streets, riots flared over words alone. Thought had escaped the scholars, it now lived in the crowd. And in the crowd, a new power formed, public opinion. It was loud, fickle, and hungry. Monarchs feared it, reformers courted it, merchants exploited it. It was a power that could not be commanded, only fed. The press had given humanity a collective voice, and with it, a collective temper. To those who stood apart, the transformation was terrifying. The philosopher Francis Bacon warned that false knowledge was more dangerous than ignorance. Spinoza wrote that freedom of thought was the soul of the state, yet he too saw how easily that freedom turned to fury. Thinkers across Europe began to study the chaos of communication, searching for rules to contain it. For if the printed word could be weaponized, perhaps it could also be understood. The Age of Enlightenment was waiting just beyond the smoke of the printing wars. But before reason could emerge, the world had to confront its own reflection, distorted, multiplied, and sold back to itself. By the century's end, the press had grown too vast to silence. The rulers who once feared it now tried to harness it. Censorship evolved into strategy. Propaganda became profession. Printers turned into publishers, pamphlets into periodicals. The war for truth never ended, it merely changed its format. Every age, it seems, must learn the same lesson, that information is never neutral, that every word carries the fingerprint of power. In the 17th century, that lesson was written not in blood, but in ink, thick, black, and permanent. The press had become both mirror and mask, reflecting reality even as it hid it. And behind that mask, a new kind of thinker was forming, the philosopher, the skeptic, the analyst one, who would try to decode the chaos, to find order in the storm of words. From the noise of propaganda would emerge the quiet birth of reason. The next revolution would not be fought on paper, but within the mind itself. In the quiet aftermath of the printing wars, Europe exhaled. The fires of propaganda dimmed, but their smoke lingered, a haze through which the first lights of reason began to flicker. From that haze, a new kind of warrior emerged. Not soldiers, not kings, not priests, but thinkers. They carried no banners and led no armies. Their weapons were books. Their battlefields were salons, cafes, and the margins of printed paper. What they sought to conquer was not land, but ignorance itself. The 17th and 18th centuries gave rise to the thinkers who would reshape the map of human thought. Their names would become synonymous with rebellion, though many never raised a hand in violence. They wrote, they questioned, they asked the forbidden why that authority had silenced for centuries. John Locke in England, Voltaire in France, Rousseau in Geneva, Montesquieu, Diderot, Kant, each one carved open the old world with words sharper than steel. Locke began with the mind. He imagined it as a blank page, not filled by divine decree but by experience. If all knowledge came through the senses, then every man, king, or commoner began equal in potential. It was a radical idea, disguised as philosophy. To the monarchs of Europe, it sounded like treason in the language of logic. To those who lived beneath them, it sounded like freedom. His work spread quietly at first, printed and reprinted across London's smoky presses, then smuggled across borders in the folds of traders' coats. By the time they reached France, they had become sparks looking for tinder. Voltaire found it. Sharp-tongued, brilliant, and unafraid, he turned philosophy into theatre. His pamphlets mocked priests and princes with wit so dangerous it had to hide behind pseudonyms. He was exiled, imprisoned, celebrated, and feared, often all at once. But wherever he went, his words followed him like echoes that could not be silenced. He called for reason over superstition, tolerance over tyranny, laughter over fear. "Écrasez l'infâme," he wrote, "crush the infamous thing." To his enemies, that meant religion. To his readers, it meant oppression in every form. Rousseau, meanwhile, sought something more elemental, the idea that society itself might be the problem. In his social contract, he dared to suggest that power did not descend from heaven but rose from the will of the people. "Man is born free," he wrote, "and everywhere he is in chains." It was a sentence that rang like a prophecy, echoing through every revolution that would follow. In a time when kings ruled by divine right, Rousseau's words were dynamite set to ink. These men did not work in isolation. The Enlightenment was not a movement with borders, it was a web spun from the presses of 100 cities. Coffee houses became its command centres, their air thick with debate and tobacco smoke. Booksellers became revolutionaries without realizing it. Each printed edition was a soldier dispatched into the world, armed with questions no army could kill. The press had changed too. The pamphlet that once carried propaganda now carried philosophy. Printers who once flattered monarchs now printed manifestos that undermined them. Paris, Amsterdam, and London buzzed with ideas disguised as entertainments, essays, dialogues, dictionaries of forbidden thought. Diderot's Encyclopédie, a collection of all human knowledge, was banned before it was even finished, yet somehow kept growing. Its pages, printed in secret, became the foundation stones of a new world. The thinkers of this age did not simply reject faith. They redefined it. They believed in reason, progress, the power of the human mind to understand the universe without intermediaries. They were heirs to Gutenberg as much as to Galileo. Their cathedral was the library, their altar the printed page. And unlike the priests of old, they invited everyone to read. But enlightenment came with its shadows. For every thinker who sought reason, another sought control through it. Governments quickly learned that ideas, like armies, could be managed or manipulated. The same printing presses that published philosophy also produced pamphlets defending authority in the language of logic. Even Voltaire, champion of freedom, wrote propaganda for kings when it suited him. Truth, it seemed, could not escape politics, only change its disguise. Yet the philosophers persisted. In their letters and treatises, they imagined a world guided not by fear but by knowledge, a republic of thought, where every person could reason for themselves. Their influence seeped into everything: education, art, law, science. Newton's laws of motion gave philosophers metaphors for the human spirit. Descartes's "I think, therefore I am" became the anthem of individuality. The age of divine command gave way to the age of human conscience. Ideas that once seemed dangerous began to sound inevitable. The notion that all men were born equal, that government was a contract between ruler and ruled, that truth could be discovered through observation rather than inherited through doctrine. These concepts spread not through conquest, but through conversation. Europe's rulers had once feared armies. Now they feared readers. The effect was cumulative, unstoppable. In drawing rooms lined with books, nobles debated the equality of man. In universities, students printed illegal copies of banned essays. In workshops and taverns, artisans quoted philosophers as if quoting scripture. The press had built not just literacy, but self-awareness. To read was no longer an act of learning. It was an act of becoming. Censorship, as always, tried to stem the tide. Printers were arrested, books burned, authors exiled. But words, once released, do not return to silence. Each confiscated text was copied by hand, smuggled, or reprinted under false titles. A banned book became a badge of intelligence. A burned book became a legend. The state could not compete with curiosity. As the Enlightenment matured, its tone shifted from wonder to purpose. The philosophers no longer wrote only for the educated elite. They wrote for everyone. Rousseau's call for equality, Voltaire's satire, Locke's logic, together they formed a chorus too loud to ignore. The world was learning to think in the plural. The rulers sensed it. Beneath the glitter of palaces, something vast and invisible was stirring. A revolution not of swords but of sentences. The philosophers had planted their ideas in the soil of the people's mind, and that soil was fertile. Soon, words would no longer suffice. Ideas would demand action. Still, in this moment before the storm, there was an eerie calm, the hush of reason before rebellion. The salons still sparkled with debate, the presses still hummed, the philosophers still wrote by candlelight, believing that if the world could just read enough, it might learn to be wise. They could not yet see the barricades their words would build, the kings their sentences would dethrone. The revolutions of the mind had begun in the margins of printed paper, but their echoes would fill the streets. The Enlightenment, born from ink and argument, would soon erupt into flame. The age of ideas was ending. The age of action was about to begin. Before there was freedom, there was ink. Before muskets and militias, before declarations and flags, there were words small, fragile, and dangerously alive. The birth of America began not in battlefields or Congress halls, but in the quiet rhythm of printing presses tucked inside colonial towns. In Philadelphia, Boston, and Williamsburg, the air was thick with the smell of oil, paper, and rebellion. Each turn of the press carried a heartbeat. Each printed page whispered a new possibility, that the governed might one day govern themselves. In the 1,770 seconds, the colonies were scattered 13 fragments, bound loosely by trade and allegiance to a distant king. Communication was slow, measured in weeks and tides, but print defied distance. Newspapers, pamphlets, and broadsides crossed rivers and borders faster than any army could march. Words stitched the colonies together long before any constitution could. The press, more than any general or politician, became the invisible architect of unity. It was in this world of anxious printers and restless readers that a single pamphlet altered history. Common Sense, written by a firebrand named Thomas Paine, was barely 40 pages long, but it carried the weight of centuries. Printed in January 1776, it spoke in plain, fiery English, not the language of scholars or lords, but of farmers, dock workers, and merchants. It called monarchy a fraud, dependency a sickness, and liberty a birthright. "We have it in our power," Paine wrote, "to begin the world over again." Those words, simple and unadorned, struck like lightning. Within weeks, Common Sense had sold tens of thousands of copies, an astonishing number for the time. It was read aloud in taverns, reprinted by rival presses, translated into sermons and songs. It did not merely inform the public, it created one. For the first time, the colonies spoke to each other in a shared voice. The press gave them a language of rebellion and a mirror in which to see themselves as a people, not as subjects. Printers became revolutionaries without leaving their workshops. They printed not for profit, but for purpose. They set their type in secret, hiding plates under floorboards when British troops drew near. They risked prison and ruin, yet the presses kept running. Pamphlets poured from them, essays, petitions, open letters, satires, each one an act of resistance. The colonies were no longer merely receiving orders from London, they were producing ideas of their own. The British Crown recognised the danger far too late. To silence dissent, it tried to control the flow of paper and ink, taxing imports, punishing printers, confiscating presses. But suppression only gave the words more weight. Every confiscated pamphlet became an object of fascination. Every act of censorship turned into proof of tyranny. The more the authorities tried to contain the message, the faster it spread. Benjamin Franklin, himself a printer before he was a statesman, understood the alchemy of words. He had seen how information could unite or divide, enlighten or inflame. His own printing house in Philadelphia had once published almanacs and essays about thrift and virtue. Now it printed revolution. He and his peers believed that liberty required literacy, that a free nation must be a reading nation. They saw presses as the new pulpits, and printed words as prayers for reason. The American Revolution, in many ways, was the first media revolution. It was fought on battlefields of paper as much as those of soil. Each colony had its printers, the Adamses in Boston, the Bradfords in New York, the Greens in Connecticut, all linked by networks of riders and couriers who carried the latest broadsides like veins carrying blood. Letters from George Washington and dispatches from the Continental Congress were typeset and distributed with astonishing speed. For the first time in history, a war narrated itself in real time. Pamphlets did what speeches and swords could not. They built belief. They gave the abstract idea of liberty a tangible form, something that could be held, read, and passed from hand to hand. The revolutionaries did not just fight for freedom. They printed it into existence. And yet, the power of the press was not purely noble. Just as it united, it divided. Loyalist printers published counter-arguments defending the crown, painting rebels as ungrateful anarchists. Colonial cities became battlegrounds of persuasion, their streets littered with pamphlets that argued, accused, and pleaded. Families chose sides by what they read. For every printer urging rebellion, another warned of chaos. The war of words was no less fierce than the war of guns. Still, the tide of public opinion was turning. By the time the Declaration of Independence was drafted, the colonies were already living in a republic of thought. When Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, he wrote for an audience that had been prepared taught, line by line, to question the divine right of kings and imagine the possibility of self-rule. The Declaration itself was born in print. Once ratified, it was not whispered or proclaimed, it was published. Copies flew across the continent, nailed to tavern doors, read aloud in squares, and carried overseas. The act of printing the Declaration was as revolutionary as its content. For the first time, a people had announced their independence through a press rather than a sword. The colony's rebellion had become a conversation messy, impassioned, unstoppable. The printed word gave form to something invisible, a collective identity. 13 colonies had become one voice, inked into existence. The revolution proved what Gutenberg's invention had always implied, that information could dissolve empires. The British Army could burn towns and occupy ports, but it could not kill ideas printed in thousands of copies. The more the empire struck back, the more the presses multiplied. The battle for freedom was being fought in parlours and workshops, in words and whispers. When the war ended, the presses did not rest. They became the foundation of the Republic. Newspapers debated the new constitution, pamphlets argued about the limits of power, and books explored what it meant to be a free people. The founders understood that liberty was not a gift to be granted, but a dialogue to be maintained. A democracy was, at its core, a conversation, and conversation required printing. The American experiment was never just about government. It was about communication, the idea that thought itself could be a shared inheritance. Printing had turned rebellion into democracy, readers into citizens. Freedom had been typeset, line by line. Yet across the ocean, another storm was gathering faster, bloodier, and born from the same fire. In the streets of Paris, presses would soon thunder again, not for independence, but for vengeance. The ink that had written freedom in the New World was already drying. In the Old World, it was about to ignite. It began, as revolutions often do, not with a sword, but with a sentence. Paris, 1789, a city swollen with hunger and restless with thought. The smell of ink drifted through its narrow streets, mingling with the smoke of bakeries and the sweat of the crowd. Printing presses thudded behind shuttered doors, day and night, spitting out pamphlets that no censor could contain. What began as philosophy in the salons, soft voices debating Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu, had escaped into the streets. The words that once filled margins were now filling the air, and the air itself was combustible. For decades the seeds had been sown. The philosophers had tilled the soil of Europe's mind, and now their ideas grew teeth. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Rousseau had written a line copied so many times that even those who had never seen the book could recite it by heart. Voltaire's laughter had turned into anger, Montesquieu's balance into fire. The printed word had become an accelerant, 1,000 sparks landing on a field of dry injustice. The monarchy, old and blind to its own fragility, still believed control was possible. Royal decrees continued to flow from the presses of Versailles, lavish, decorative, and utterly disconnected from the hunger gnawing at Parisian stomachs. But in the alleyways and taverns, the presses of the people told another story, one of debt, inequality, and despair. The cost of bread was rising, the cost of silence was unbearable. And so they printed everything. Pamphlets denounced the clergy and the nobility, each line sharper than the last. Caricatures mocked the King and Queen Louis as a glutton, Marie Antoinette as a serpent. Satire had become sedition. Printers who once published poetry now produced manifestos. Apprentices set type with trembling hands, glancing at the door, ready to flee if the guards appeared. Every printed sheet was a risk, a confession, a spark. By the summer of 1789, Paris was drowning in words. Pamphlets piled on street corners, sold by children who could not read them. Newspapers multiplied overnight. L'Ami du Pupil, Les Révolutions de Paris, Le Père Duchesne, each promising truth, each dripping with fury. Some called for justice, others called for blood. To read was to choose a side. The revolution had become a conversation no one could stop. The Bastille fell not just to a mob, but to momentum. For months, print had been whispering that such a day would come. The pamphlets spoke of tyranny, of freedom, of the people's will. When the prison gates finally broke, it was not only stone that fell, it was the old order of silence. The presses, those iron beasts, thundered their approval. Soon, the revolution's leaders began to understand what kings had known before them, that the press could rule as easily as it could rebel. Robespierre, Marat, and Danton mastered the art of printed persuasion. Marat's L'Ami du Peuple became the voice of vengeance, its headlines demanding heads as proof of justice. Each morning, Parisians lined up to read who would die next. The guillotine became the punctuation mark at the end of every argument. Ink and blood ran side by side down the same streets. Printers who had once defied the crown now found themselves serving new masters, men who claimed to speak for the people. But truth, once unleashed, obeyed no one. For every revolutionary paper, there was a counter-revolutionary one. For every call to unity, another to purge the impure. The press, that tool of enlightenment, had become a chorus of chaos. Still, it was unstoppable. The revolution devoured words as quickly as it devoured its own. Speeches printed one day were outdated by the next. Leaders rose and fell with the headlines. A rumor could topple a minister. A single pamphlet could start a riot. It was as if France had traded one monarchy for 1,000 invisible kings, each made of paper and ink. And yet, in that fever of fear and idealism, the dream persisted. The same presses that condemned aristocrats also printed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It was born not in silence, but in the roar of public debate, written, revised, and reprinted until its words became scripture. Liberty, equality, fraternity. 3 words printed countless times, carried on banners, stitched into flags. They were more than slogans. They were spells. But the magic came at a cost. The revolution's children turned on each other. The press, which had once bound them, now divided them. Newspapers accused rival factions of betrayal, corruption, cowardice. Each tried to define the revolution's truth. Each blamed the others for its violence. And as the guillotine worked, the presses kept pace. Pages fluttered through the air like the ashes of a burning faith. In the end, the revolution consumed its own storytellers. Marat was murdered in his bath, the ink still drying on his last denunciation. Danton's eloquence could not save him from the machine he had helped create. Even Robespierre, the incorruptible, fell beneath the blade, his final speech unfinished, his words silenced by the echo of his own logic. The presses printed his death, as they had printed his rise, impartial and unblinking. And yet, out of the terror, something new emerged, a modern faith in the power of the printed word to define reality. The guillotine and the press were siblings. Both promised clarity, both claimed justice, both demanded sacrifice. One ended bodies, the other ended illusions. Together, they carved the shape of a new world, one where no voice could rule unchallenged, and no truth would remain untold for long. When the smoke cleared, France was unrecognizable. The monarchy was gone, the church stripped of its power, and the people, those who had once read in whispers, now shouted across continents. The revolution had proven what the Enlightenment had only theorized, that ideas, once printed, could outlive their creators and command the living. Printers who survived the purges returned to their craft with haunted reverence. They understood now that the press was no longer a tool, it was a force of nature. It could birth nations or bury them. It could illuminate or incinerate. The same ink that had carried philosophy now carried ideology. In the aftermath, Europe trembled. Monarchs looked to Paris with dread, fearing that their own people might soon start reading too much, thinking too freely. The revolution's message that power could be rewritten traveled faster than any army. And wherever it landed, the ground began to quake. France had burned itself into legend. The age of ideas had ignited into action, and from its flames rose the modern world scarred, loud, and forever literate. The pen had proven mightier than the sword, but also just as bloody. As the presses cooled and the guillotine rusted, one truth lingered in the air like smoke. Words, once freed, could never again be contained. From the ashes of revolution, a new world was waiting to be written, one where nations would be built not by divine right, but by ink and will. By the dawn of the 19th century, the printing press had already rewritten the story of Europe. Kings had risen and fallen by its ink, revolutions had burned in its pages. But beyond the continent's edges, the machine continued its quiet pilgrimage, a pilgrim of iron and type, carrying not just words, but the promise of transformation. Across deserts and oceans, through empires and ports, it travelled like a contagion of curiosity. Yet, as it moved, it changed. The press that left Europe never arrived unchanged. Every civilization that met it made it its own. The Islamic world, proud of its centuries of scholarship, had once ruled knowledge through handwritten tradition. From the golden script of Quranic calligraphy to the intricate illumination of manuscripts, the written word was not merely communication, it was devotion. When the printing press appeared at the edges of the Ottoman Empire in the late 15th century, it was greeted not with excitement, but with caution. Mechanical reproduction, many feared, would dishonor the sacred page. A machine could copy words, but not reverence. For centuries, the Ottomans forbade the printing of Arabic script by Muslims, fearing errors in holy texts and the loss of the scribe's spiritual touch. Christian and Jewish communities in Istanbul were granted exceptions, quietly operating presses for their own languages. It wasn't until the 18th century that a man named Ibrahim Mutafarrika, a scholar, diplomat, and dreamer, persuaded the Sultan to permit a printing house for secular works. Geography, astronomy, history, these were allowed. Scripture, still, was off limits. And yet, even that small concession cracked open the door. The presses of Istanbul began to whisper the same language that had once echoed through Mainz and Venice. Knowledge, multiplied, cannot be contained. Further east, in Persia and Mughal India, the press arrived like a stranger with many faces. Missionaries carried it first, eager to print Bibles in native tongues, but it was local thinkers who gave it life. In the courts of Hyderabad and Lucknow, poets saw in the press not desecration but expansion, a way to preserve fading traditions and languages that had lived only in memory. Urdu, Persian, and Sanskrit found new breath in lead and ink. Each printed poem became an act of reclamation, the mechanical hand serving the human voice. Still, resistance was never far. In Mecca, scholars warned that mechanical writing stripped words of soul. In Cairo, some saw the press as a Western invasion, a device of control, not enlightenment. And yet, every empire that tried to resist the machine found itself quietly overtaken by it. Ideas, once imported, refused to remain foreign. By the 19th century, Egypt's presses were producing textbooks, newspapers, and translations of European philosophy. The modern Arabic press was born, and with it, a new age of dialogue between the old world and the new. Across Asia, the echo deepened. In China, printing had existed for 1,000 years before Gutenberg, carved into wood, pressed by hand, painted with ink and care. But Europe's press brought a new rhythm. Faster, harder, louder. The Ming and Qing dynasties viewed it with both pride and suspicion. Why celebrate a technology they had invented centuries earlier? Yet this European variant carried something unfamiliar: mass production, standardization, speed. When Jesuit missionaries introduced movable metal type to Beijing in the early 17th century, Chinese scholars marveled at its precision, but doubted its necessity. Woodblock printing, with its elegance and artistry, already served the empire well. But change is seldom a matter of need. As the centuries turned, typefaces multiplied, newspapers appeared, and the slow machinery of tradition began to quicken. By the late Qing era, printing had become an engine of reform. Journals of philosophy, science, and politics spread ideas that no imperial edict could unprint. The written word, once bound by dynasty, now belonged to the people. In Japan, the encounter was more explosive. The Tokugawa shogunate, wary of foreign influence, had long kept its gates closed to the outside world. Yet even isolation could not silence curiosity. Through the port of Nagasaki, the Dutch smuggled in European texts, medical treatises, maps, and scientific diagrams, each one laboriously copied, translated, and reprinted in secret. When Japan's borders finally reopened in the mid-19th century, the printing press rushed in like a flood. Within decades, newspapers, novels, and political pamphlets filled the cities. The same machine that had once carried scripture across Europe now carried modernity across Asia. In Africa, the story took a different path, one marked by both liberation and loss. Missionaries brought the press to Ethiopia, Ghana, and South Africa, not as a gift, but as a tool of conversion. The first printed words on African soil were often foreign prayers, written in alien alphabets. Yet, over time, the press became an instrument of resistance. African scholars and poets began to print in their own languages: Amharic, Swahili, Zulu, Yoruba, defying colonial erasure. By setting their words in type, they reclaimed history itself. Every local script carved into metal became an act of defiance against the idea that only European words mattered. Printing had become global, but its meanings were local. In every culture it touched, it was both bridge and blade. It preserved traditions even as it disrupted them. It democratized knowledge, but also carried empire in its gears. For every poet it empowered, it served a governor. For every scholar it freed, it printed propaganda for a king. The press, by now, belonged to no one and to everyone. In Istanbul's coffee houses, readers debated the future of Islam through newly printed treatises. In Calcutta, reformers wrote essays calling for education and equality, setting the stage for independence movements yet to come. In Tokyo, serialized novels brought samurai epics and social satire to a rapidly modernizing public. And in Lagos, printers founded newspapers that dared to speak against colonial rule. The press had crossed oceans, but it had not crossed unscathed. It carried with it both the tools of enlightenment and the blueprints of domination. By the 19th century, the world was a library with no central author. The press had dissolved the monopoly of Europe's voice, scattering knowledge across continents like wind-blown seeds. The machine that once printed Bibles now printed manifestos, schoolbooks, romances, and revolutions in dozens of alphabets across hundreds of tongues. Humanity, for the first time, was speaking to itself on a global scale. And yet, for all its reach, the press remained mechanical, slow, human, deliberate. Every page still bore the trace of the hand that inked it, the wheel that turned, the weight of effort behind each impression. But somewhere in the furnaces of the Industrial Revolution, new engines were roaring to life, machines that would devour time and multiply the word beyond imagination. The age of the press was becoming the age of production. Metal was no longer a tool, it was a force. The slow, rhythmic heartbeat of Gutenberg's invention was about to accelerate into something unstoppable. The world had learned to think in print. Now it would learn to move in steel. The 19th century roared to life not with the cry of war, but with the hum of machines. Steam, iron, and electricity began to transform everything that once moved by hand. And the printing press, that patient creature of ink and pressure, was reborn in the fire. Where Gutenberg's press had whispered, the new machines thundered. Where once each page was a craft, now it was an industry. Humanity had not just learned to print, it had learned to mass-produce thought. In smoky London workshops, blackened with soot and the smell of hot oil, engineers began to fuse mechanics with imagination. The old wooden hand press, the slow, creaking descendant of Gutenberg, was replaced by gleaming iron giants. The Stanhope press, the Koenig press, the steam-powered rotary. Each new design pushed words faster, farther, cheaper. The first newspaper, printed by steam in 1814, astonished the world. Over 1,000 copies an hour, each identical, each perfect. The rhythm of civilization began to sync with the rhythm of machines. The transformation was more than mechanical. It was psychological. For centuries, the printed page had been an object of reverence, scarce, deliberate, almost sacred. Now it became a flood. Knowledge, once gated by scarcity, was set loose in torrents of paper. The city streets filled with broadsheets, advertisements, and serialized stories. The smell of ink became the scent of modern life. The printing house was no longer a workshop, it was a factory, and ideas now were products. In England, the Industrial Revolution poured fuel into this new fire. Coal-powered presses churned through the night, fed by rivers of type and rolls of paper that never seemed to end. The cost of a newspaper fell so sharply that even the working poor could afford one. Literacy rose, not as a privilege, but as a necessity. In the glow of gaslight, labourers read headlines about faraway wars and nearby injustices. The printed word had once belonged to scholars and kings, now it belonged to the crowd. The result was an awakening, and a new kind of chaos. The mass press gave voice to everyone, but not equally. Industrial print made possible the rise of journalism as a force of power and manipulation. Newspapers became the new empires, their editors new monarchs. The truth could reach millions, but so could lies. Every publisher had the means to manufacture reality. Headlines could stir nations to outrage or lull them into apathy. The age of industrial print was also the age of industrial persuasion. Yet even in this cacophony, beauty found its place. Writers like Charles Dickens and Victor Hugo learned to wield serialization, telling stories not in books, but in monthly installments. Each episode was devoured by readers hungry for more, their lives punctuated by the arrival of the next chapter. The novel became the shared dream of a generation, the bridge between classes. Literature no longer whispered from libraries, it shouted from newsstands. The printed story became both entertainment and empathy, the factory-made heartbeat of imagination. Across the Atlantic, in America's young and expanding republic, the press grew with the frontier. Steamships carried newspapers down the Mississippi, and railroads delivered them to towns barely older than their first editions. The telegraph, a kind of invisible printing press for words, allowed news to travel faster than any man. Breaking news was born. The world began to feel smaller, events more immediate. A famine in Ireland, a gold rush in California, a war in Crimea, all could reach breakfast tables within days. The printed word had become time itself, immediate, relentless, unstoppable. But industrial printing did not only serve enlightenment, it also served empire. The same presses that printed manifestos for workers' rights printed propaganda for colonization. Posters promised prosperity in foreign lands while hiding conquest in fine print. Maps printed by the thousands redrew continents without consent, turning rivers and mountains into lines of ownership. Printing was no longer just the instrument of human expression. It had become the machinery of control. In Paris and Berlin, the mass press birthed ideologies that would later shape nations: socialism, nationalism, liberalism, all inked into existence before they were enacted in law. Political cartoons mocked kings and ministers with merciless wit. The revolution of 1848, which shook nearly every capital in Europe, began as words on paper before it ever spilled into the streets. Governments, realizing too late the power of print, responded with the same old fear. censorship. But the age of control had passed. Printing presses could now be built, hidden, and moved faster than laws could be written. The written word had achieved mobility, and mobility meant immortality. In the colonies of Asia and Africa, industrial presses became tools of both oppression and liberation. British and French administrators used them to distribute decrees, but local thinkers used the same machines to print resistance. Newspapers in Calcutta and Cairo spoke the language of defiance. African writers published essays challenging the myths of European superiority. Each press became a battleground between empire and identity. Once again, the machine refused to serve only one master. Meanwhile, printing itself was evolving. Type foundries began casting thousands of fonts, each one a new voice. Posters, pamphlets, and advertisements covered the walls of cities, transforming streets into galleries of persuasion. Print had become visual, bold, colourful, immediate. Art and commerce entwined. Lithography brought images to the page with dazzling precision. For the first time, words and pictures shared space, speaking together in a new language of mass imagination. The machine, once slow and human, had achieved something almost biological. It could feed, breathe, multiply. Entire rooms pulsed with motion, rollers turning, plates pressing, pages flying. The sound was no longer rhythmic, but alive, a mechanical heartbeat echoing through the century. In those factories of ink, men and women laboured in shifts, unaware that they were building the nervous system of the modern world. By the late 1800s, the press had conquered time itself. Linotype machines replaced hand-set letters, casting entire lines in molten metal. The rotary press could print millions of pages a day. Newspapers became global corporations. The same story could appear in New York, London, and Bombay within hours. Information had finally become industrial, vast, fast, and inescapable. But something had changed in the soul of print. It no longer smelled of ink and hope, but of machinery and repetition. Words that had once been born in thought were now produced in schedules, aligned with profit margins and political interests. The intimacy between writer and reader, once the quiet current of the printed world, was now mediated by scale. The press had fulfilled its destiny and lost part of its innocence. Yet even in its enormity, it carried the same pulse Gutenberg had set centuries earlier, the belief that what is printed endures. Industrial print did not erase that dream, it amplified it. Millions now read what only thousands once could. The worker, the student, the farmer, all became participants in the written world. The dream of a literate humanity was no longer fantasy. It was reality pressed into paper. The age of industrial print had turned the written word into a force of mass consciousness. The world no longer waited for the elite to interpret it. It read itself. But the more humanity printed, the faster it craved to print more. The gears of the machine spun faster each decade, and soon ink alone would no longer be enough. Beyond the presses, another revolution was waiting, one of wires, signals, and speed. The printed page, so powerful and permanent, was about to meet its ghost, information unbound by matter. Metal had become movement, and soon movement would become light. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had achieved what its ancestors could scarcely imagine, a civilization built entirely on information. Words travelled faster than ships, farther than empires, deeper than bloodlines. News crossed oceans in seconds. Opinion circled the globe before truth could dress itself. Humanity had unlocked the infinite library it had always longed for and discovered that infinity could be terrifying. The printing press had once been an instrument of liberation. It had broken the chains of ignorance, dethroned kings, and whispered rebellion into the ears of peasants. But freedom, multiplied endlessly, became noise. The world now hummed with it, a constant throb of headlines, pamphlets, telegrams, and leaflets. Each claimed to reveal the truth, each contradicted the last. The human mind, once awed by knowledge, began to suffocate beneath its weight. In the streets of industrial cities, the newspaper had become the new sunrise. Unavoidable, daily, relentless. Every morning, millions unfolded their printed rituals. Wars, elections, crimes, scandals, inventions. The ink that once promised clarity now blurred together into a fog of endless novelty. Yesterday's revelation was today's routine. Humanity, having conquered silence, discovered that it could no longer rest within it. The press no longer waited for meaning. It demanded immediacy. Every event was a story, every rumor a sale. The machinery of news, powered by profit and urgency, learned to feed the public's most volatile hunger, fear, curiosity, outrage. Editors became alchemists of attention, distilling chaos into headlines sharp enough to wound. The more people read, the less they understood. The world was not growing wiser, it was growing louder. And yet, no one could turn away. Knowledge had become a drug. The very act of knowing, of reading, of keeping up, felt like survival. To be uninformed was to be invisible. To fall behind was to disappear. For the first time in history, ignorance was not merely a condition, but a choice, and one that society refused to forgive. Philosophers and poets began to sense the paradox, forming beneath the hum of progress. "We are drowning in information," one lamented, "but starved for wisdom." The same machines that had once united humanity in literacy were now dividing it into illusions. Every opinion had an echo, every belief a printed ally. Readers no longer sought truth, they sought confirmation. The press, once a mirror of reality, had become a hall of reflections. Technology accelerated the spiral. The telegraph shrank the world. The photograph made news visible. The radio turned words into waves of sound. Humanity no longer waited for print to deliver reality. Reality arrived uninvited, at every hour. What had once been miraculous now became ordinary. The cost of knowing everything was that nothing stayed sacred. Wars, too, changed shape under the weight of information. In earlier ages, battlefields were distant places, glimpsed only through rumor or myth. Now they arrived at breakfast. Newspapers printed casualty lists beside advertisements. Posters turned patriotism into print. Propaganda, that new, terrible offspring of the press, learned to wear the mask of truth. Lies no longer needed to hide, they simply needed to repeat. During the Great War, words killed as efficiently as bullets. Governments flooded their citizens with carefully managed narratives, victories exaggerated, defeats erased. Soldiers carried newspapers to the trenches as reminders of the world they fought to defend, only to discover that the stories told at home bore little resemblance to the mud beneath their boots. The machine that had once promised transparency had become an engine of illusion. When the war ended, the noise did not fade. It only found new frequencies. The 1,920 seconds and 30 seconds gave rise to the age of the broadcast voices, without faces, words without paper. Radio became the new cathedral, where millions gathered to listen rather than read. And once again, the dream repeated itself. A tool of unity became a tool of manipulation. Dictators spoke to nations through microphones, their words amplified by invisible waves. Ideas that once crawled from city to city now flew across continents. A lie could travel faster than morality could chase it. In the glow of progress, few noticed the exhaustion setting in. The more humanity learned, the less it could bear to process. Knowledge no longer expanded the mind, it fragmented it. The flood that had once carried civilization forward now threatened to wash away its foundation. The scholar, the journalist, the citizen, all struggled to separate truth from noise. The line between enlightenment and overload had grown too thin to see. In cafes and libraries, new thinkers began to whisper the unthinkable, that perhaps ignorance had been a kind of grace, that not every question required an answer, that silence was not emptiness, but balance. But their voices, too, were drowned in print. The world had become addicted to its own reflection, unable to stop watching itself speak. As the century advanced, information became not only abundant, but weaponized. Totalitarian regimes learned that control did not mean suppressing the press, it meant mastering it. Control the headlines, and you control the heartbeat of a nation. Control the textbooks, and you control its memory. The printing press, once the champion of freedom, had become the architect of obedience. But the danger was no longer confined to governments. In democracies, too, information became the new battlefield. Competing ideologies, rival newspapers, and partisan publishers all fought for the same prize belief. Citizens were courted like consumers. Truth was tailored to fit the taste of each audience. The more diverse the voices became, the more divided the listeners grew. The irony was complete. The machine that freed us also taught us to drown in knowledge. It democratized thought, but destroyed consensus. It liberated the mind, but shackled it to distraction. Humanity had learned to read everything and remember nothing. Every printed word, once a step toward clarity, now seemed to dissolve into the static of infinite commentary. And yet, amid the chaos, something endured. Beneath the noise, there remained a quiet hunger for meaning, for stillness, for the kind of truth that no press could mass produce. In libraries, in late-night studies, in the quiet turning of a page, people still sought what the machine could not replicate: the intimacy of understanding, the fragile miracle of attention. Knowledge had become infinite, but wisdom remained scarce. The price of knowing was not ignorance overcome, but innocence lost. Humanity had opened the vault of truth and discovered that the treasure was too vast to hold. And still, the presses turned, faster, louder, tireless. They no longer waited for permission, nor for comprehension. The machine had become its own momentum, an echo of Gutenberg's first dream, multiplied beyond measure. The story of print had reached its paradox. The more we knew, the less we understood. Yet even this was not the end. Beyond the clamour of paper and politics, a new silence was forming, not of ignorance, but of transition. The machine that had defined 5 centuries of civilization was beginning to evolve again. Ink was giving way to electricity, type to signal, page to screen. The word was leaving matter behind. And once more, the world was about to change. The machine never truly stopped, it only changed shape. After 5 centuries of turning gears, of ink and pressure and paper, the printing press dissolved into light. The same dream that began in Gutenberg's workshop to copy thought, to share it endlessly, was reborn in a language of code. The digital age did not end printing, it completed it. The word, once carved in metal and pressed into parchment, now travelled at the speed of electrons. What Gutenberg began with lead and oil, humanity finished with silicon and light. The 20th century ended as it began obsessed with information. But now, the press no longer needed a press. Words no longer weighed anything. They floated in circuits, invisible yet everywhere, filling the air as once they filled the shelves of libraries. The internet was not a replacement for print, it was its reincarnation. Every screen, every glowing device, became a miniature press, a cathedral of thought without walls. Humanity had finally achieved what it had always sought, the ability for everyone, everywhere, to speak. And yet, once again, the question returned: who listens? Who believes? The digital press democratized creation as the printing press once democratized literacy. Blogs replaced broadsheets, websites replaced pamphlets, and social media became the new tavern, the new scriptorium, the new battlefield. Anyone could publish, and everyone did. The distance between author and audience collapsed entirely. The power, once hoarded by kings, priests, and publishers, now belonged to the crowd. The printed word, once an artifact of permanence, became fluid, editable, deletable, endless. For the first time in history, the archive of humanity was alive, updating itself in real time. Every correction, every revision, every voice added to the chorus. The Library of Alexandria had burned. The Library of Everywhere could not. It was immortal, infinite, and like all things without limits, terrifying. Because when everyone can speak, the world no longer whispers, it screams. The old problem of censorship returned in new form. No longer the banning of books or burning of pages, but the quiet shaping of algorithms. The gatekeepers no longer wore robes or crowns, they hid behind code. What people saw, read, and believed was no longer determined by editors but by machines learning what each person wanted to hear. Gutenberg had dreamed of freedom through multiplicity. The digital press offered infinite voices, yet each listener heard only their own echo. The promise of truth, once born from print's permanence, was now tested by its liquidity. In a world where every page could be rewritten, what did truth even mean? The printed lie of one century had been limited by ink. The digital lie could be replicated endlessly, disguised perfectly, and shared invisibly. The more humanity knew, the harder it became to know what was real. And yet, there was wonder in it too. For the first time, A child in a remote village could read the same poem as a professor in Paris. A scientist could publish a discovery and be read across the planet within hours. A protest could begin with a hashtag, spread faster than revolutions ever could, and force governments to listen. The same technology that fragmented humanity also united it, not perfectly, not peacefully, but undeniably. The world had become one vast printing house without borders. But unlike the presses of old, there were no apprentices here, no masters, no singular invention to point to. The press had become invisible, embedded in phones, satellites, servers. The act of reading had become so constant it was almost subconscious. The dream of literacy had evolved into a new kind of existence, perpetual awareness. But awareness came with fatigue. The flood of digital text, like the floods of ink before it, began to erode meaning. When words are endless, attention becomes scarce. The digital page refreshed faster than thought could follow. Truth now competed with novelty, knowledge with distraction. Humanity's oldest fear to be silenced was replaced by a new one, to be unheard. Still, in the chaos of the web, echoes of Gutenberg remained. The layout of a website resembled a printed page. Fonts still mimicked the texture of type. We scroll as we once turned pages. Even our metaphors, pages, publish, bookmarks, carry the memory of ink. The digital press, for all its speed and noise, was not a departure from history but its continuation. The same hands that once set movable type now tapped keyboards. The same hunger that once copied scripture now copied code. Humanity was still chasing the same miracle, the need to make thought visible. But perhaps the most haunting symmetry of all was this, that the internet, like the early press, began as freedom and evolved into power. In its infancy, it was a wild commons of curiosity. Over time, it became an empire of influence, ruled by corporations as vast as any monarchy. The democratization of expression led to the concentration of visibility. Everyone could publish, but not everyone could be seen. The machinery of communication, once physical and finite, had become abstract and omnipresent, too big to grasp, too fast to question. And yet, even this was not the end of the story. The press had always been a mirror, reflecting not just what we know, but what we are. Every revolution in print, from Gutenberg's Bible to Paine's Common Sense, from Voltaire's satire to the viral post, revealed the same truth, that technology amplifies not wisdom or deceit, but the human heart itself. The digital press was no different. It reflected our fear of silence, our hunger for meaning, our tendency to worship the very noise we create. It was both cathedral and marketplace, sanctuary and chaos. The same paradox that haunted the first printers now returned, that the tools we build to free our minds eventually reveal how easily we cage them. Yet somewhere amid the glow of screens, the old dream still lives. In the quiet act of reading, one mind meeting another across the abyss of time, the essence of the printed world remains untouched. Whether in ink or pixels, on parchment or glass, the miracle endures. Thought made tangible, the human voice preserved against oblivion. Gutenberg's press never died. It simply learned to code. The hum of servers now replaces the clatter of type. The cloud has replaced the library. But the question remains as old as the first line ever set in metal. Who controls the word? Who decides what is remembered? Who edits history when history has no final page? The machine no longer needs hands to turn it, yet it still depends on hearts to guide it. For every algorithm that sorts and filters, a human somewhere decides what matters. And that more than any invention is the true legacy of print, the eternal struggle between freedom and order, between chaos and truth. As the digital press continues its ceaseless rhythm, humanity stands once again at the same threshold where Gutenberg once stood, gazing into the infinite, trembling with the same question that began it all. Now that everyone can speak, who will choose to listen? The circle is complete. The word, once bound to matter, is now bound to nothing at all, free, untethered, immortal. The machine continues, humming softly through the circuits of the earth, echoing its oldest promise, that as long as we seek to be understood, we will always build new ways to say, I was here. Every word ever printed is still echoing somewhere in the dark. Perhaps not on paper, perhaps not even in ink, but in the quiet circuitry of the mind, in the unseen architecture of thought. The story of printing, from Gutenberg's trembling hands to the light of a digital screen, has never truly been about machines. It has been about memory, our most fragile, most human inheritance. Every page ever pressed, every line ever read, was an attempt to resist forgetting. To say, softly but defiantly, we were here. Long after empires have fallen and cities have been swallowed by dust, the written word remains like a pulse beneath the ruins. The world forgets its monuments faster than its metaphors. A tower collapses, a poem survives. The press did not just preserve knowledge, it preserved continuity. Before print, memory depended on the fragile breath of storytellers, on the fading pigments of scribes. But once thought found a home in type, it learned how to outlive the hand that made it. Somewhere, the first printed Bible still sleeps, its ink thick and uneven, each page a testament to human persistence. Somewhere else, the brittle pamphlet of a forgotten reformer gathers dust in a museum drawer. Each carries the same heartbeat. Across 5 centuries, the press built a memory that could not be contained within a single mind, a single age, a single belief. It became the great mirror reflecting not just what humanity knew, but who it believed itself to be. Every civilization before print had lived with the terror of erasure. Floods, fires, invasions, each could annihilate centuries of wisdom in a single night. The Library of Alexandria burned, the scrolls of Persia vanished, the manuscripts of the Maya dissolved in conquest. With printing came a quiet defiance. If 1,000 copies of a text existed, then no flame, no empire, no forgetting could erase it completely. Humanity had built not just a machine of words, but a shield against oblivion. And yet, what printing gave us was more than preservation, it was connection across time. The press allowed voices long buried to rise again and speak. Every reader became a listener to the dead. When we read, we do not merely see letters, we resurrect presence. The author is gone, but their thought still breathes. The page becomes a séance of meaning. The ink on a page is dry, but the moment of reading is alive, a small miracle repeated billions of times across centuries. The memory of humanity is not orderly, it is not neat or curated. It is vast, tangled, contradictory, a great ocean of words where philosophy and poetry drift beside propaganda and prayer. But within that chaos lies the truest reflection of what we are, creatures desperate to be remembered. We have written in stone, in ink, in binary, all in the hope that someone, somewhere, will listen. Every printed word is an act of faith that the future will care. When the first printer pressed metal into paper, he unknowingly pressed eternity into motion. The press taught humanity that memory was not just a passive thing, but an act, something we build, maintain, and share. In every era since, the same instinct has guided us. Monks copying manuscripts by candlelight, editors hunched over proofs, programmers typing code into a glowing screen. Each is performing the same ritual, the preservation of meaning against time's erasure. And yet, for all its noise and progress, humanity has always returned to silence. Every word begins and ends in it. The press, in its way, gave us more silence, not less the kind we find within ourselves when reading. In that quiet space between sentences, we become more than listeners, we become witnesses. Reading is the most private conversation humanity has ever invented. Each of us, alone before a page or screen, is joined to every soul who has ever sought understanding. That is the real miracle of printing, not that it spread knowledge, but that it created communion. The words that survived the centuries are not those that shouted the loudest, but those that listened best to fear, to wonder, to love. Printing has been both our confessional and our telescope. Through it, we have mapped the stars and the human heart, chronicled our wars and our lullabies, recorded every discovery and every doubt. What it gave us, more than anything, was a continuity of feeling, proof that the questions we ask today are the same ones whispered 500 years ago. Who are we? Why are we here? What will remain of us when we are gone? And so we arrive here, at the end of the long story of ink, where the past hums faintly beneath the fingertips of the present. The presses of metal and steam have quieted, replaced by invisible networks and digital light. But the echo remains. The dream of permanence still beats within every attempt to write, to archive, to preserve. The tools have changed, the longing has not. If we could listen carefully beneath the hum of servers, the rustle of books, the scroll of screens, we might hear the same ancient sound, that filled the first print shop in Mainz, the sigh of words being born. Each generation adds its voice to the chorus. Each believes, as Gutenberg did, that to write something down is to grant it life beyond the self. The memory of humanity is not kept in libraries or clouds or archives. It is kept in the act of remembering itself. Every time we read, we keep the chain unbroken. Every word we pass on becomes a thread in the vast fabric of being. The press, at its core, was never a machine. It was a promise. That thought could survive its thinker. That truth could outlive its moment. That memory could become immortal. And perhaps that is the secret hidden in all our inventions, that we build them not merely to know, but to be known. From quill to keyboard, from scroll to screen, every evolution has been a gesture against disappearance. To print is to remember, to read is to resurrect. The world may one day lose its machines again, its servers silenced, its paper crumbling, but the words will not die. They will live in the next medium, whatever form it takes, as they have always done. For memory is not contained by matter. It moves through us, remade in every telling, reborn in every voice that dares to speak. So we end where we began, in quiet awe of the written word. The press was never merely history's tool. It was its heartbeat. Through it, humanity learned to listen to itself, to remember itself, to forgive its own forgetting. And when the last page is turned, when the screens go dark and silence returns, perhaps that silence will not be empty. Perhaps it will hum faintly, like a pulse beneath the earth, the echo of every thought ever set free, still whispering the same ancient vow, that as long as we remember, nothing is truly lost. Before the word, there was silence. And after all the words, there is silence again, not the heavy kind that comes from ignorance or fear, but a quiet, shaped by understanding. It is the same stillness that follows a song once its last note fades, when the echo lingers longer than the sound itself. Humanity, after centuries of speaking, printing, and remembering, has arrived once more at that moment, between breaths, the pause where meaning rests. The story of the written word has never truly been about words. It has been about the spaces between them, the waiting, the listening, the invisible rhythm that holds sound and silence together. Every invention, from Gutenberg's press to the glowing screen, has been an attempt to bridge that gap, to translate thought into form, silence into signal. Yet when the noise of civilization grows too loud, something deep within us yearns to return to where it all began, to the stillness that gave the first word its shape. In that stillness lies something sacred. It is the breath before creation, the hush that precedes revelation. When we speak, when we write, we disturb it not to destroy it, but to give it motion. The printed word is not the opposite of silence. It is its continuation by other means. Every sentence carries a residue of quiet, every page an invitation to pause. That is what makes reading, at its heart, a meditative act. It is conversation with silence itself. If one could step back and listen to all the centuries of language, to every word ever inked or typed, every cry of discovery, every confession, every lie, it would sound less like a storm and more like a tide. Waves of meaning rising and falling, each retreating into silence before the next begins. Civilizations rise, empires fall, technologies evolve, but the rhythm remains unchanged. Humanity speaks, listens, remembers, then returns to quiet. Perhaps that is why, in the end, silence feels less like an ending and more like a return. The press that once thundered with revolution now hums in museums and memories. The digital servers that pulse with light today will one day go dark. The words we write will outlive us, but even they will someday fade, absorbed into new languages, reinterpreted by new minds, forgotten by new generations. Yet the impulse that created them, the need to express, to connect, to leave a mark, will begin again, as it always does, in silence. It is tempting to see progress as a straight line from the quill to the keyboard, from paper to pixels, from ignorance to illumination. But history is not linear, it is circular. The silence before words and the silence after them are the same silence. Each age believes it is the first to speak, and each learns, eventually, that it is only continuing a conversation far older than itself. When the first scribe pressed pigment into clay, he was already echoing the painter who once traced constellations on cave walls. When Gutenberg pressed ink into parchment, He was answering the monk whose candlelit prayer preserved forgotten scriptures. And when we press keys today, sending words into the endless ether of the digital world, we are not inventing new language. We are rediscovering the ancient urge to reach across time and be heard. The tools change. The silence does not. Listen closely, and you can almost hear it, the faint heartbeat that runs beneath every word. It is the same pulse that beats in the pauses of poetry, the same quiet that lives in the white space of a page. It reminds us that communication was never about domination or display, but about communion. To speak is to reach, to listen is to receive. Between the two lies the silence that makes both possible. As the world grows louder, every second filled with messages, alerts, and headlines, that silence becomes rarer, more precious. It is no longer absence, it is sanctuary. The press once gave humanity the power to speak. Now, perhaps, its greatest gift is teaching us when to stop speaking, when to let the echo of what has been said settle into meaning. Imagine, for a moment, the earth seen from far away, a pale sphere turning in the dark. From such distance, no words can be heard, no ink can be read. Yet all the voices, all the presses, all the libraries, still vibrate faintly within its atmosphere. The planet itself hums with the residue of everything humanity has ever uttered or written. It is the quiet murmur of an intelligent species remembering itself. A cosmic archive, bound not in leather or light, but in the thin whisper of air surrounding a fragile world. And what of us, the readers, the inheritors of this long, word-filled journey? Perhaps the truest act of understanding is not to add more noise, but to listen to what remains after the noise fades. To sit within the silence, not as emptiness, but as completion. For silence is where words go to rest, and where their meaning finally becomes clear. Somewhere, a press sits idle, its metal cold, its wheels stilled. Somewhere else, a screen glows softly in the dark, waiting for a touch, a thought, a word. And somewhere beyond both, silence stretches, infinite and alive, the great blank page upon which all creation waits to be written. It asks for nothing but attention, patience, humility. The circle closes. The first word was born from silence. The last will dissolve into it. Between them lies everything. History, memory, belief, imagination. Humanity has filled that space with light and shadow, wisdom and folly, beauty and terror. And through it all, the silence has endured steady, patient, unchanging. It is not the opposite of knowledge, but its foundation. It is where understanding sleeps, waiting to be awakened again. When the final page turns, when the last press stops, the story will not end. The silence will remain, holding all the words that ever were, and all the ones still waiting to be written. And maybe that is the meaning we've been chasing since the first mark on stone, that silence is not what comes before or after life's language, but what holds it together. It is the canvas behind every idea, the breath that carries every voice, the home to which every word returns. So let the presses rest, let the screens dim, let the echoes fade into the gentle hush of comprehension. For in that hush, everything spoken still lingers not as sound, but as presence. The silence after the words is not an ending. It is a continuation, the oldest, truest form of listening. And if you listen closely enough, beneath the noise of time, you might still hear it, the faint murmur of a world remembering itself.